The young lady arrived at the meeting place today. She was getting married to a man she had never even heard of before. All those present rejoiced as they saw a beauty from the Western Empire for the first time. She understood that now she would finally see the face of her precious husband. After walking a few steps, she was dumbfounded with shock. She could not believe what she was seeing. The young man looked at Lady Arena and greeted her with a smile, introducing himself to her. Duke Cassian Ternagensky said with a smile that they met again. The young lady was in shock. The young lady was taken aback and wondered if she really had to marry him. She thought that fate had decided to play a cruel joke. The acquaintance of the young people began one very interesting day at a ball in the lands of the Western Empire 3 months ago. The young lady saw that everyone was having fun at the event, but she in turn did not want to be there. She knew that today was the imperial banquet, and she needed to attend the event. But unfortunately, she completely ignored him, and like the last drunk, got drunk with the knights from the order. She thought that in general she wouldn't show up on it, but unfortunately everything didn't go the way she wanted. But this morning, her mother threatened her if she did not show up at the imperial ball. She only wanted to bow to the emperor for decency's sake and leave when suddenly she heard the conversations of the young ladies. They said that the duchess was furiously looking for her daughter everywhere, and they said that the lady seemed not to have turned up. They said that the young lady was in trouble this time. And in Arna's imagination, her mother looked fierce. She understood that if her mother caught her, she would have to live in hell for 30 lives. She wanted to first meet the emperor secretly from her mother, and later ask him about everything. She knew looking at the castle that the emperor was now definitely on the 3rd floor. A moment later, she jumped over with ease and climbed onto the balcony. Arna, in turn, landed gracefully and noticed that someone was standing on the balcony. The young lady was taken aback as she looked up and saw that there was a man in front of her. The young man, in turn, froze in bewilderment, since he did not at all expect to see a beautiful lady. Arnie and the young man stared at each other in silence for a moment. The young lady, in turn, understood that now she had a matter much more important than the mystery of his identity. The young man slowly extended his hand to her, but to his surprise, she ran away. The young man froze in bewilderment. The knights approached him and said that they had heard some suspicious noise. He said with a smile that a charming stray cat had just dropped in on him. Arna, in turn, remembered the young man. She wondered who he was. A moment later, looking back, she noticed that the corridor was empty. The young lady was puzzled because she had a very bad stomachache. A moment later, the young lady finally entered the hall without any obstacles. She noticed that everyone present was wearing masks, and looking around on the table, she noticed an unattended mask. But in fact, the mask had an owner. A moment later, the young lady was hurriedly looking for her mask. Walking a little further, Arnie noticed a crowd of people. She raised her eyebrows and realized that the Emperor of the Western Empire was now standing in front of her. Her immediate superior is Cyclone, and also her uncle. She wanted to go up to him right away and greet him. But a moment later she noticed her mother. Duchess Rosalia Brilt asked with a restrained smile if the young lady had seen her daughter. Arnie, in turn, was in shock as she realized that she was in trouble. She realized that she needed to run away from the hall as quickly as possible. The young lady looked at the Duchess and said that it was difficult for her to find her daughter since everyone here was wearing masks. The Duchess said it was quite possible, but her daughter didn't know there was a masquerade ball that day. Arna was in shock. She didn't understand why they were following her now. The Duchess was shocked and wondered what her daughter was thinking about. Arna ran away in a hurry. The lady trembled with fear and prayed that her mother would move on. The young lady asked what was wrong. The Duchess apologized and said that she needed to go somewhere for a minute. The young lady, in turn, closed her eyes as she heard approaching footsteps. The young man approached her and said with a smile that he had found his stray cat. Arnie was taken aback, frozen in place. Looking at the young man, he looked at her with a smile and wrapped her in his cloak. She asked in surprise if they had met somewhere before that day. He smiled and told her to keep quiet. and the young lady obediently followed his order. The Duchess apologized and said she didn't know there was anyone in such a place. He said with a smile that she had no need to apologize, as he was now with his companion who was very shy. The Duchess said with a smile that in that case she would not disturb them. She told her friend that she had made a slight mistake. Arna was relieved after her mother left, but she was still surprised and didn't understand why he helped her. He looked at her and asked with a smile if she had found what she was looking for. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and, asking for forgiveness, asked what he was talking about. He looked at her intently and said that it seemed she was not an invited guest. She was too lazy to explain. She looked at him intently and asked why he was so calm, knowing that she was not invited to the event. He looked at her and said with a smile that he was just curious. She looked at him intently, as it didn't look like they had seen each other before. He looked at her and said with a smile that he was interested in a stray cat. She asked if it was because she climbed over the balcony, and he confirmed her question with a smile. The young lady, in turn, was puzzled, as she had the feeling that she was going to vomit. She looked at him and thanked him for his help, and said that she would come back later and repay him. Arnie handed him her badge and told him to take it. She wanted to leave quickly, without further ado. Arna turned around hurriedly and said that she had to go. The young man froze in bewilderment. A moment later, a servant approached the young master and called him. He asked what the master had in his hands. Cassian said with a gentle smile that this was probably what a cat's gratitude looked like. The young man was in shock. He didn't know why the gentleman was so happy. Cassian looked at the assistant and asked what happened. The assistant looked at the master and said that the emperor was calling him. Compared to the Northern Empire, where he came from, the land here is much richer, but this is only thanks to the swordmaster of Elgos. Throughout history, only 100 people have been awarded the title of Ball, but it has nevertheless saved many countries from destruction. A master of the sword, who after so many accomplishments, has not given a single reason to doubt his greatness. The emperor said with a smile that the swordmaster, unfortunately, never appeared, even when he called. The emperor knew that if word spread to other countries that Lady Arna was a master swordsman, the Duchess would be furious that her daughter was preventing her own marriage. A moment later, the young man heard some noise. He turned around and saw an interesting picture. He looked down with a smile and noticed that the young lady had been caught after all. The emperor said that they could return to the discussion of a marriage between their countries. The emperor asked if he had caught the eye of any young lady. In fact, the banquet was held so that Cassian could find a suitable match for himself. The emperor told him to let him know if he already had anyone in mind. The young man knew that the girl's status was not important to him at all. It was only important that she suited him, according to all criteria. He remembered the young lady who thanked him for his help and said that she would come back later and repay him. The young man pushed the thing that the young lady had given him towards the emperor. The emperor was in shock. He could not utter a word. He understood that this was a disaster. The emperor now saw the coat of arms of the house of Arna before him. He did not know what to do. Cassian said with a smile that he would marry this very girl. The pinnacle of the military power of the Western Empire is the hero, the strong savior, respected by every citizen of the empire, and also the head of the Order of the Golden Dragon. Arna was just such an inimitable person. Brilt, she was a most venerable swordmaster. The Duchess looked at her daughter and told her to get married already. The young lady did not listen to her mother. At home, she is just a disobedient daughter who could not be slung onto her husband's shoulders. The Duchess looked at her daughter and asked if she knew Ariel. She said that he was definitely her destiny. The Duchess said that all her peers had already experienced the joy of marriage. The young lady in turn sighed heavily. She had no time for marriage. The Duchess asked if she knew her nickname in society. The young lady asked in bewilderment whether she was really called a swordmaster or the hero's savior. The Duchess said that she was not called that, and the young lady thought for a moment. A moment later, she asked with a smile if they really called her a mad dog. The Duchess said with fury that she was called the Emperor's mad dog. The young lady heard the cool nickname and became proud of it. The Duchess said that even if she starts talking about an engagement with her daughter, the guys just run away because she beat them all at some point. The young lady was shocked as the swordmaster received a slap on the back from the annoyed mother. The Duchess said that as her mother, she just wants her to be happy. Arna asked in bewilderment whether a woman's happiness really lay only in marriage. The Duchess said that of course it did not. She said that every woman has her own happiness. She said that her heart still bleeds to see how she doesn't even try to find her love. The young lady thought about love for a moment. She didn't want anything like that at all. The Duchess said with a smile that a suitable partner had already been chosen for her, and the Emperor had taken care of it. The young lady was shocked by her mother's statement. She did not understand why the decision was made without her. The Duchess said that they had chosen the Duke of Terneugen from the Northern Empire as her husband. The Duchess said with a smile that they said he was the first suitor in the Northern Empire. The young lady was shocked that they were going to marry her off to a foreigner. The young lady said that she would never marry a man she didn't even know. The Duchess smiled and told her daughter to just try to meet him. She said that all the swans were blinded by his beauty. Arnie angrily told her mother to calm down because she would not be dating anyone. 3 days later, the Duchess followed her daughter with a smile and said that she thought it would be a wonderful union. A week later, the Duchess did not back down, saying that the young man was from a noble family and also a skilled knight. 2 weeks later, the Duchess begged her daughter to fulfill her last request. Arna could not bear it and told her mother that she had won. The long-awaited day of her viewing arrived, and the young lady in turn was a little puzzled by the fact that she was being married off to a foreigner. Until now, she had lived a quiet life, even being alone. She understood that now her freedom could end. The Duchess said with a smile that her daughter was the most beautiful in the world. The Duchess smiled at her daughter and said that they had to hurry, as the Duke was already waiting for them. The young lady looked at her mother with a smirk, as she knew that she could make him refuse to marry himself. The meeting was to take place in the reception room of the imperial palace. Arna looked at her mother and asked if she really needed to accompany her straight to the palace. The Duchess said that her father and the Emperor would arrive soon. The young lady in turn understood that it would simply be suicide if she carried out what she planned. The Duchess, smiling, was having a casual conversation with the maid. However, the young lady understood that she simply had no choice. She knew she could just escape through the window. Arnie quietly walked up to the window and opened it. While her mother was chatting casually, she quietly climbed out through the window. The Duchess looked at her daughter in shock. She called her, but the window was already empty. The Duchess, in turn, was simply furious. She was burning with fire and calling for her daughter. The young lady was a little confused and didn't know what to do next. A moment later, she saw a carriage slowly approaching her. She ran to the carriage with a smile, as she wanted to borrow it for a while. The young lady opened the door and saw a handsome young man. The young lady froze for a moment, not knowing what to do. She didn't expect to see him. The young man looked at her and said with a smile that they had met again, and at the same time, he called her a stray cat. The young lady was shocked to see her friend who saved her last time. A moment later, she looked back as she heard her name being called, shouting at her to stay put. Arna understood that if she was caught now, she would be in a very bad way. She gracefully stepped into the carriage. The young man looked at the young lady with bewilderment and a smile. He understood that something interesting was about to happen. Arna looked at the young man and asked for forgiveness, and also asked if they could continue driving. He looked at her and said with a smile that she now looked as if she was trying to escape from an unwanted marriage. Cassian smiled and said that she could use it if she needed it. The young lady thought about what he said for a moment, but she was still confused, as she didn't understand why he was always helping her. She looked at him intently, wondering what he wanted in return for his help. He looked at her and smiled, and told her not to worry, as he didn't need anything from her. She found it all very interesting. and she nevertheless decided to take advantage of this opportunity. She looked at him and said that since he was offering it, she would accept his help. Cassian said with a smile that it was just wonderful. She asked if he could pretend to be her partner for just one day. He smiled a beaming smile and said that he would be honored to accompany her. The young lady looked out the window in confusion and asked where they were going. Cassian said with a smile that they were going on a date. The young lady was taken aback because she was surprised she didn't expect him to say something like that. He smiled and said that she asked him to pretend to be her boyfriend, and they should show the world that they were a couple. Cassian said that it was best to do this where there were many people, so that the news about them could be clearly conveyed to everyone. Arnie thought he was going a bit overboard. He said that if word got out that she already had a lover, her engagement would definitely be postponed. She smiled and said that he had a good idea. She was glad, because she knew that she would definitely break off the engagement in this way. He smiled and said that it was time for them to go to a wonderful cafe. He said that he heard that this cafe had wonderful desserts. Arna looked at the dessert with bewilderment, as she was more accustomed to fierce battles than to sweets. A moment later, he noticed that everyone was whispering behind their backs, the young ladies admiring Lady Arna's handsome partner. They wanted to come up and ask as they were simply delighted with the young man, but Arna did not hear their whispers. She ate it with pleasure, a wonderful dessert, and accidentally got dirty. He looked at her and asked with a smile if she wanted everyone to know as soon as possible that she had a boyfriend. She looked at him in confusion, as she did not understand what he was talking about. Cassian slowly reached out to her and wiped the cream from her face. A moment later, he licked the cream off his finger and said that the rumors were true, and the dessert was very tasty. He looked at her and said with a sly smile that this was the fastest way to tell society that they were a couple. Everyone present was in shock, and the young lady in turn was almost burning with shame. She did not understand what he was doing. The young lady looked at her companion and thanked him with a smile, for today he said that he was glad to help her. She was a little surprised, since she even enjoyed spending her time with him. But still, she knew that she would only benefit if rumors spread that she was with another. She said with a smile that she would definitely return the favor to him. Arna knew that he was finally done with the marriage. He looked at her and said with a smile that she would have to try hard to repay him in full. He asked if the very thought of marriage weighed on her so much, since she had previously said that she had not even seen her betrothed. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was just her parents' whim. Arnie came to her married sister for advice. The lady said that the Duke should have been married at least once. She said that there was clearly some kind of catch here, and if not, then he was trying to cover up his state affairs with her. The young lady smiled and said that she did not think that the man who agreed to marry her was mentally sane. She said that the thought of having to leave her homeland, and especially marry and live with a foreigner, was simply freezing. Cassian was puzzled, as it was the first time in his life that he had been spoken to in such a way, and he said with a smile that he hoped she could handle it. Rumors spread like wildfire that Lady Arna had a lover, and a real handsome one at that. Arna was sure that her engagement was broken off. The Emperor was shocked when he read the news in the newspaper. The Duchess called her daughter and said that she admired her courage in going on a date with another man right on time for the viewing. The Duchess said that she loved her so much that she wouldn't even mind if she married her secret lover. The Duchess said that the Duke of Ternugin had said that he was not at all concerned about the rumors, and the young lady was shocked. The Duchess smiled and said that she was asking for little, and her daughter could choose whomever she wanted. Arnie was in shock, as her plan had failed. She knew that all she could do was say it straight out. She looked at her mother and shouted that she didn't want to get married. The Duchess stood in shock looking at her daughter, as she did not expect this. A moment later, the Duchess sat down in a chair and told her daughter that she could marry and remain married for only 3 months. The young lady looked at her mother in bewilderment, as she did not understand what she was talking about. The Duchess looked at her and said with a smile that, if she didn't like her husband, she could get a divorce and return home. Arna was surprised, as she did not expect her mother to say something like that. The duchess said that she should curb her temper. The duchess said that if after all her efforts her opinion did not change, she would never again mention marriage. The young lady in turn agreed with her mother, as she knew that she could hold out, and then everything would be over. The duchess said that her daughter must give up fighting and killing, as these are mandatory conditions. Arna said she wasn't sure she could stick to the terms, but she understood. Thus, her marriage was concluded, and the news of the young lady's imminent marriage literally shook the Western Empire. One of the knights told the emperor that if Lady Arna went abroad, they would lose their military power. He didn't understand what the emperor was thinking when he made this decision. The emperor said that he was going to grant the lady the title of Princess of the Western Empire. The emperor looked at the young lady and said that she was the future of the Western Empire. Everyone present was shocked. The young lady in turn knew that her uncle was overdoing it, and she felt awkward and difficult. At the same time, in the Northern Empire, the young lady was discussing the news of the Duke's marriage. One of the young ladies was very angry and did not understand why everything happened this way. The emperor's son is second in line to the throne, taking first place among the most eligible bachelors of the empire. Every young lady's dream of being with a duke has now simply sunk into oblivion. The news of the marriage has created a great stir in the Northern Empire. However, the duke himself, who was the culprit of everything that happened, was calm. The duke looked at his assistant and asked if they had found out anything new. The assistant said that they had found out nothing more. The duke remembered the conversation with the emperor and the moment when he showed him the sign of Lady Arna's house. The duke saw that the emperor was clearly nervous. He wondered if he had just imagined it. The assistant looked at the gentleman and said that something was bothering him. The duke asked in bewilderment what exactly was worrying him. He knew that there was something. He said that there was talk that Duke Brillat had a problem child, a promising one, but he was nicknamed the Emperor's mad dog. The assistant said that it would turn out that the reason it was difficult to dig up anything about the Duke was because of that mad dog. Cassian thought for a moment and asked his assistant what he was talking about. The young man said that he heard that if you say something wrong to him, he can beat the person half to death. The Duke was shocked that such a cruel man and the young lady were from the same family. He wondered if this was the reason she was so carefree, but he was still very curious. The assistant looked at his master and said that the airship had arrived. He knew that the young lady would be very surprised when they met. The maid smiled and told the young lady that they were about to land. Madame told the lady not to dare kill the groom. Arna was shocked by such a statement. Madame said that she shouldn't beat people just because she doesn't like them, and even more so, she shouldn't use a sword. Madame had said that she should smile, speak in a sweet voice, and be elegant. Arna wondered what kind of monster the nanny thought she was. Sometime later, the nanny said with a smile that it was time for them to go. A moment later, the arrival of Her Grace Lady Arna was announced. Cassian greeted the young lady with a smile and said that he had been waiting for her. Arna was shocked, as she did not expect to see something like this. He introduced himself with a smile and said that he was the Duke of Tergen. She was shocked because she realized that he was the very Duke she was supposed to meet. Now she understood why he was sitting in the carriage and helping her. Arna was shocked because she realized that he was simply making fun of her. A moment later, she turned around as she wanted to leave. Without looking at the nanny, she told her that they were coming back. The nanny was in shock from everything that was happening. The nanny shouted at the lady to stop, and the Duke in turn also called her. He came closer to her and asked with a grin if she had forgotten that she had promised to repay him. The young lady looked at him with fury. The nanny saw her angry look. The nanny shouted at the Duke to be careful. Madame said that their lady was very weak, and he needed to treat her like fragile crystal. Arnie was in shock. She didn't understand what her nanny was saying at all, since she didn't look like fragile crystal at all. The maids were looking for their mistress. In a hurry, they had told her earlier, "Don't wander alone." Arna was sitting in a tree while they were looking for her. The young lady wondered how it had come to this. The maids were screaming that her delicate skin might be harmed. The Duke looked at the young lady sitting high in the tree with bewilderment. He saw that the maids were looking for her. He looked at the beautiful and fragile lady with a smile, and in turn wondered how she got there. He felt as if he had picked up a stray cat rather than found a wife. A moment later, the young lady realized that someone was watching her closely. She wondered if she had been noticed as a chill ran down her spine. She looked closely out the window as she realized that someone was watching her from there. She knew she had to go down first, and with the grace of a cat, she descended with ease. The young lady hid behind a tree. She heard the maids looking for her. One of the maids said that they had not yet looked the other way. Arnie sighed heavily. She was glad that they didn't notice her. The Duke came closer to her and asked with a smile what they didn't notice. The young lady was shocked, as she did not expect him to come from behind. She asked in confusion how long he had been standing there. Cassian said that he had just arrived. She wondered why he was so calm. Arnie looked at him intently. She didn't know if he saw her jump from her tree. He looked at her and asked with a smile if she really liked him that much. Arna asked with bewilderment what he was talking about. He said that she must like his face for her to look at him like that. But the young lady hesitated, not knowing what to answer. The Duke enjoyed teasing her, smiling at her what it was like to meet her husband against her will. Arna smiled and said that it was not so bad. The Duke was surprised by such an answer. She didn't see any flaws in him. She wanted to ask if he had someone on the side. Arna sighed heavily, but didn't ask anything. She felt awkward. He looked at her and said with a smile that she was standing in front of him, but thinking about something else. The young lady looked at him in shock. She was very embarrassed. She asked where he learned these sweet words. She told him not to forget, since they were still not married. The Duke said with a smile that this matter could be fixed, and he slowly approached her. He took her hand and looked at it tenderly. The young lady froze. The Duke kissed her hand tenderly and said that it was too late to run. Arna was shocked, as she did not expect this. Terneugen Castle was noisier than ever, and there was only one reason for that. Today was the wedding ceremony of the castle's owner. The nanny cried with joy that their lady was getting married. She wanted the duchess to see her. The young lady looked at the nurse and said that she spoke as if her mother had given up her soul to God. The duchess said that she was still in the very dawn. The duchess said she was very sorry to miss her daughter's wedding. Arna said she saw everything through a magic sphere. The duchess said her father would also be watching her ceremony. The duchess said that her uncle had come to the Northern Empire to personally attend the ceremony. The young lady was shocked. A moment later, the maids told the young mistress that she was ready. Arna looked closely at her reflection. The maids admired the young lady and said that she was the most beautiful bride of all. The young lady couldn't believe that she would have to go through all this, even though she didn't even want to get married. The duchess looked at her daughter and said with a smile that she shone like a star in her dress. The duchess congratulated her with a smile on the birth of her new family. Arna, in turn, saw that her mother was very happy. She knew that above all, this ceremony would bring joy to her mother. Sometime later, the wedding hall was already full of guests. The young man was in shock and did not understand why the Duke suddenly wanted to get married. He noticed that the young ladies were whispering and discussing the bride the Duke had chosen. The young man was puzzled by everything that was happening. He did not understand what his master was thinking, since he knew that this wedding was out of the blue. A moment later, the newlyweds entered the hall and were greeted. The young ladies were shocked because they saw that the bride was simply beautiful. Arna, in turn, was worried and wondered if she was doing the right thing. The Duke looked at his bride with a warm smile, but he saw her anxiety. A moment later, the ceremony began. Arna was in shock and wondered if she was really getting married. They expressed the strength of the bride, whether she swears to always love the groom. The young lady was taken aback when she heard the word always. She wondered if it was okay to make a false oath, but she said she would anyway. The priest asked the groom if he swears. The Duke smiled and said that he swears. The priest smiled and said that in that case they could seal their vow with a kiss. Arna was shocked, as she did not expect such a thing. The young lady looked at the Duke with embarrassment, and the Duke in turn slowly opened her veil. He came closer to her and with a sly smile said that if she wanted to run away, then this was her last chance. She looked at him intently and said that he himself said that it was too late to run away. The Duke looked at her intently and said with a smile that everything was correct. Arna, in turn, could not take her embarrassed gaze off him. The Duke pulled her closer and said it was too late. A moment later, he kissed her passionately. The young lady was in shock as she was embarrassed, and her husband could not breathe. The priest looked at them and said with a smile that he now proclaimed them husband and wife. Arna was shocked. Arnie, looking at her husband, understood that this wedding was a complete failure. She knew that either she would cut him or he would eat her. The maids hurriedly carried the young lady into the room and told her that she needed to rest as her fragile feet were tired from the shoes. They told her that she might fall. If she took one more step, she in turn knew that she was okay and not weak. She remembered their kisses and became very embarrassed. She understood that she had to forget about him. The maids looked at her in bewilderment. A moment later, the maids with smiles on their faces said that they had arrived at the Duke's chambers. The lady sat down on the bed. She knew that now she could rest. She was in shock, did not understand what was happening at all. The maids said with a smile that they would now take their leave. They smiled and wished her a good night. Arna was shocked and did not understand what they were talking about. A moment later, she realized that tonight was her wedding night. She knew she couldn't just sit in the room because she didn't want to be the wife who killed her husband on their wedding night. She knew that running away was the best solution. She knew that now was her only chance to leave. A moment later, she heard her husband's voice and shuddered. He looked at her and asked her in bewilderment what she was going to do. The young lady was shocked. The Duke looked angrily at his wife. He was dissatisfied with her actions. She was in shock because she realized that she had been caught again. The young lady looked at her husband intently. She didn't know whether she should tell the truth or just knock him out. He looked at her and asked what she was going to do. He didn't like that she was standing on the windowsill. Arna laughed and said that she just wanted to get some fresh air. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted to get some air in the middle of the night by climbing onto the windowsill. He asked angrily if she was planning to commit suicide. She was in shock, didn't understand what he was saying at all. Arna realized that he had understood everything wrong. She said she had no intention of doing anything like that. She didn't know if it was possible to die from jumping from such a height. He sighed heavily, looking at her. She thought it would be better if this situation remained a misunderstanding. She couldn't just say now that she was trying to run away because of her wedding night. The Duke came closer to his wife and took her hand and looked at her tenderly so that she would calm down. Cassian looked at her and told her not to neglect herself. The young lady was worried she didn't know what to do. She wondered if she would have to spend the night with him. The Duke remembered how the nurse had told him to be very careful with the lady, as she was weak. He remembered the moment when the nanny told the Duke to treat her like fragile crystal. The Duke was shocked. He then realized that he had to be careful with her, but he didn't think that her family would drive her to suicide. Arnie looked at him intently, knowing it was not too late to knock him out. A moment later, the Duke lifted his wife into his arms, and she looked at him with embarrassment. The Duke looked at his wife tenderly. He understood that she was very fragile. Arnie was in shock because she understood that she couldn't spend the first night with someone she didn't even know. A moment later, the Duke laid her on the bed and covered her with a blanket. The young lady was in shock and did not understand what was happening. She wondered how to make sense of his behavior at all. The Duke looked at her and said with a smile that she had been through a lot today and needed to get some sleep. Okay. Arnie was a little embarrassed by his kindness, but still wondered how it was possible to just sleep on your wedding night. He looked at her and with a smile told her not to think about anything and just fall asleep. A moment later, he simply walked quietly out of the room without saying a word. She understood that everything was as she wanted, but still he behaved very strangely. She did not understand what kind of stupid feeling had visited her. For aristocrats, Braga was a kind of simple instrument, a union that pursued only family well-being. That is why many thought that this is exactly what the Grand Duke's marriage would be like. Until we saw the newlyweds at the wedding. The young ladies were shocked by the way the Duke looked at his wife. They said that it was a pleasure to watch them. The absence of the newlywed wife, caused by the excessive care of the servants, gave rise to various rumors. The men didn't understand what the point was in missing their own wedding banquet. You said that it seemed like he was very protective of her. The man said there were rumors that His Majesty had personally driven away men who spoke ill of the Duchess. His companion was surprised and asked if it was true that the Duke had fallen in love at first sight. The misunderstanding only grew, but in reality everything was different. At the same time, the young lady was sleeping quietly in the tree. The Duke looked intently at his wife, who was sleeping quietly on the tree. He was a little surprised. His assistant looked at his master intently. He did not understand what was going on at all. Alan wondered if this was really love. The Duke looked at his assistant and said he had a question. Alan said that the gentleman can ask questions, and he will answer all questions. The Duke asked what it could mean if a wife wanted to commit suicide on her wedding night. The young man was shocked by such a question. He asked if this did not mean that she did not want to be ringed to the death. The Duke said he was probably right. Alan looked at the gentleman and said he almost forgot. He said that yesterday the second prince asked him to deliver an invitation. The Duke asked if he had delivered the letter and immediately left. Alan said that this was exactly the case, and also asked the gentleman when he planned to meet the Emperor. The Duke said that he would meet soon. The young lady in turn sat quietly and sipped her tea, not worrying about anything. The Duchess looked at her daughter with a smile. She asked her daughter if she liked everything. Arnie choked on his tea at the unexpected question. The Duchess smiled and said that she probably liked it. The nanny looked at the lady and asked if she was okay. The young lady wanted to break the sphere immediately. The Duchess said that her subordinate knights of the Golden Order had gone on strike to get her to return. The Duchess said that the Emperor had asked her to tell her that the young lady was shocked that they were on strike. The Duchess said that they had already lost contact with some of them. She said that the Emperor was terribly upset. The lady said that since she was out of reach, her mother could have told Sarno everything Genzogina said, that her daughter herself said that she had not seen him. The young lady smiled and said she had a lot to do, but in reality, she was just too lazy. The young lady was furious that they had gone on strike. She knew that they would be shown no mercy. A moment later, the maid approached the young lady and called her. The maid said with a smile that His Majesty had sent her gifts. The Duchess smiled and said it was very romantic. Arna wondered if he imagined that she had tried to commit suicide. A moment later, she heard something. She had the feeling that she saw something. She looked back because she did not understand what kind of feeling had come over her. Arna looked intently into the bushes because she knew for sure that someone was following her. A moment later, she saw the knight who gave her a beaming smile. The young lady was shocked. She didn't understand what he was even doing here. Arn was in shock. She wondered what this idiot who should be in the Western Empire was doing here. She deliberately did not invite him to the wedding, so that there would be no suspicion that she was a knight, something that most likely she was just imagining. But a moment later she clearly saw Crave, who greeted her with a smile. She understood that the first thing she needed to do was drive him away before anyone noticed. She looked at him and asked him angrily what he was doing there, and told him to get lost. Crave laughed and said with a beaming smile that he didn't want to. The young lady was furious to hear that he did not want to leave. She knew that in that case, she would have to throw him out herself. As she stood up, she felt someone's presence behind her. A moment later, she accidentally stepped on her dress, and she realized she was about to fall, caught her tenderly, and asked with a smile if she was hurt. The young lady looked at him intently, for she finally realized that she had not imagined it. She was confused, because last time she didn't even feel that he was behind her. The young lady looked intently at her husband. Arna wondered if he was trained to hide his presence. She knew that if that was the case, Then he had long since realized that she was a master of the sword. Cassian thought that she was like a cat whose fur stood on end. He looked at her and asked with a smile what she was doing. Cassian noticed something in the bushes. The maids looked at them and said with a smile that they would leave them. The young lady smiled and said that she had not done anything special. She asked with a smile what had brought him here. Arna knew that he must not know that Crave was here. The Duke looked at his wife and asked with a smile if she liked his gifts. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. A moment later, she turned around and saw the gifts. She asked if he was talking about them. The Duke saw her interesting reaction. She laughed, patting the gifts, and said that she liked them very much. The young lady hoped that he did not suspect anything. The Duke in turn realized that she did not care about the gifts. The Duke in turn noticed something in the bushes. He looked warily where there was movement. The Duchess looked at her son-in-law and said with a smile that she could see his face. Arna was taken aback as she remembered that her mother was still on the line. The Duke greeted the Duchess of Brilkt with a smile, and the Duchess was glad to see her son-in-law. The Duchess said with a smile that she had a charming son-in-law. She told her daughter that she was very lucky. Cassian said with a smile that now he understood who his wife was. So beautiful from the Duchess was very glad that he was saying such nice things. But the young lady in turn was very embarrassed. The Duchess said with a smile that her son-in-law was a very nice young man. Arnie shouted at her mother to calm down and stop saying such things. The Duchess wanted to say something, but the young lady could not listen to such things any longer and decided to turn off the ball. She decided to throw it away later. The young lady sheepishly asked her husband for forgiveness. He smiled and said that everything was fine, since her mother was very nice. The young lady in turn looked at her husband with surprise, since she did not understand in what way her mother was pleasant. She understood that she needed to quickly change the subject of the conversation. Arnie looked at him and asked why he had come to her after all. She asked if it was working hours. Now Arnie didn't really want to see him after yesterday. The Duke looked at his wife and with a gentle smile asked if she was feeling better. The young lady looked at him in confusion, as she did not understand what he was talking about. But a moment later, she finally realized that he had come because of yesterday's incident. The Duke looked away from his wife and asked if marriage to him was really so painful for her. Arna was shocked because she knew that this misunderstanding had gone too far. The Duke looked at her and said that he would certainly help her if she told him why she decided to do such a thing. The young lady timidly said that there was no need for that, and she did not need anything. She was in shock and did not know what to tell him. She knew she would rather fall into the ground. She looked at him and asked him not to worry about yesterday since she was fine. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he understood her. He said that he understood that she did not want to talk about it now. The Duke looked at his wife and said that she could open up to him when she was ready. The young lady was in shock, as she understood that she would just go crazy now. Arnie wondered if she should tell him the truth. Cassian said that it was time for him to go, but the young lady was not willing to let him go like that. A moment later she grabbed his hand and asked him to wait. She looked at him timidly and said that she would like to explain everything. She hesitated and began to talk about the first wedding night. The Duke looked at his wife in bewilderment, as he did not understand what she wanted to say. The young lady said in a hurry that she was just scared on their wedding night, and that was the reason she just wanted to run away. The Duke stood frozen in shock as he realized that she simply wanted to escape and nothing more. She didn't want to lie to him, but at the same time, she couldn't say that she was afraid that their wedding night would end with his murder. He looked at her and asked if she wanted to run away because she was scared. A moment later, he looked away from her and laughed. The young lady froze in place, not understanding his reaction. The Duke was shocked because now he understood why she behaved like that. For a moment he felt relieved. The Duke was shocked and could not believe that his wife was so sweet. He came closer to her and with a gentle smile said that if she didn't want it, then he wouldn't touch her with a finger. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if this was true. The Duke smiled and said that of course it was, and he also said that it would be their little secret. The young lady looked at him in surprise. She understood that this was not the first time this had happened. She remembered him telling her that she could use him if she needed to. Arnie was confused because his proposals were unclear. Arnie wanted to find out what kind of person he was and what he was capable of. But nevertheless, she agreed with him with a smile. Well, why can it wait for now? The Duke sat down at the table slowly, as he had a lot of work to do. But at the same time, he remembered his wife, who said that she was scared on their first night. The Duke thought for a moment with a smile on his face, for he knew that his wife did not seem like the kind of lady who would be afraid of such a thing. Alan looked in surprise at the Duke, who was thinking about something intently and laughing. He looked at the gentleman and called him. Alan felt uneasy. He wondered if something had happened to the Duke. The Duke looked closely at his assistant and asked what had happened. The young man was taken aback but did not give any clear answers. A moment later, the assistant asked the gentleman if he could help him with anything. Cassian looked at his assistant and said that he would end up in the castle. A rat had appeared. The Duke said that he needed to find and kill it. The maids were shocked and did not understand how this could have happened. They stood in front of the broken sphere and wondered with rage who could have done such a thing. One of the maids said that everything looked strange, since the ball had a protective spell cast on it, and a simple person could not break it. The head maid was furious. She asked all the maids who did it. The young lady, in turn, sat and quietly sipped tea. She was very happy in her soul. The young lady broke the vile magic sphere on her own, while no one was looking. The maid approached the young lady and asked for forgiveness in a trembling voice. Arna looked at the maid in bewilderment. The maid, with tears in her eyes, said that she had to watch over the magic sphere. The maid said that she could not take her eyes off her. She asked for forgiveness and begged for leniency. The main servant screamed furiously at the girl and said that she would not pay for the sphere, even if she worked 10 hours like a slave on a galley. She could not believe that the girl could break such a valuable thing. Arnie looked at everything that was happening with bewilderment. She didn't particularly want to interfere. Arnie quietly called her nanny and asked if she knew what would happen to that maid. Eva looked at the young lady and said that for breaking a priceless thing, she would be thrown out like a dog. Eva said that the girls would of course have to pay off the debt, but she had made a huge mistake, and after that, no family would accept her into their home. Eva said that she would never work as a maid again in her life. Arna was shocked because she realized that she had ruined the life of a young girl. The young lady approached the maids and asked what the noise was. About Arna understood that she had broken the sphere, so she needed to resolve the situation herself. The head maid looked at the young mistress and said that she did not need to worry. The young lady said that this was all happening in her castle, so she had the right to know what happened. Eva was shocked by Arna's words because she said that this was her castle. Eva thought that Arnie would never get used to someone else's house. She wanted to joyfully tell the good news to the Duchess as soon as possible. Arnie, she knows that the magic sphere broke in such a way that they made a mess that even a deaf person would hear. She said that she doesn't understand why they create such chaos because of a stupid thing. Arnie looked at everyone present and said that it was not such a big problem, so they could forget about it and go about their business. She hoped that the maid would not be kicked out after that. The maid, in turn, looked at the young lady with tears in her eyes and her mouth open. The other maids had the same reaction as they did not expect this. Arnie mentally asked them to have mercy on her because she saw that they were about to devour her with their eyes. The head maid looked at the young lady and asked if she was sure they could leave things like that. Arna said with a smile that they were all human and had the right to make mistakes. She said that they could buy a new sphere. Arnie looked at the maids and said that the circus was over and they needed to go about their business. The maid approached her mistress and called her in a trembling voice. Arna looked at her in bewilderment. The young maid fell to her knees and, with tears in her eyes, said that she would be faithful to her until the end of her days. Arna was shocked by everything that was happening. A moment later, the young lady approached the maid and told her to calm down. The maid told the young lady that she was her real benefactor and she had saved her. She said that she would be grateful to her for her mercy until her death. Arnie was shocked since she herself had broken the sphere. Erica said that she would work hard and would not even regret risking her life for her. Arnie was puzzled and calmed the maid down. Eva came closer to them and opened the box with a smile. The Duchess said with a smile that she knew something like this could happen, so she took care in advance and bought a lot of spheres. Arnie was in shock. She wondered why she had done all this. The maid in turn was very glad that everything had turned out this way. The young man looked at the head maid in surprise and asked if everything really happened like that. The head maid said that everything was true and everything was exactly like that. The Duke in turn thought for a moment since he did not think that she would care about such a thing. The servants looked at the master in surprise and asked puzzled where he was going. The Duke smiled and said that he wanted to go to his wife. He wanted to talk to her about what had happened. They looked in surprise at the door, which quickly slammed shut after the Duke had left. The young man was shocked since his master had never refused to work before he noticed that his master had become very strange lately. Erica was looking for her mistress in a hurry. She was shouting that she would serve her faithfully and truly. The young lady was puzzled. She did not understand why she always found herself in such situations. She wondered if it was her mood. A moment later, someone suddenly called her, and she became frightened and screamed. She looked into the distance in surprise and saw her friend. She was shocked because she thought he had already left. She looked at him with fury and asked why he was here. Arna didn't want him near her at all. A moment later, the young man came closer to her. Arna looked at him in bewilderment and asked what he was wearing. Crave looked at her and said with a smile that he was now in disguise. He was pleased with himself. Arn, in turn, looked at the young man with bewilderment. She was in shock. She didn't even know what to answer. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked if he had really taken a job as a maid. He smiled and said that it was true. She was furious and just wanted to kill him. Arna didn't understand how it had come to this. She looked at him closely and asked if anyone had seen him. The boys said that he was just a master of disguise and infiltration, so no one had seen him. Arna wondered what place he was a master of. She looked at him and asked him angrily what he was doing here. The young man said that he had submitted his resignation and had come here to see her. Arnie looked at him in bewilderment and asked why he did that. Crave was taken aback by such a question and said loudly that his place was next to the commander. The young lady, in turn, was amazed. She was shocked by his answer and did not know what to do with it now. She knew that talking was useless here and decided to just ignore him. The young man looked at her and said that he had no choice but to swear allegiance to His Majesty because it was his duty. He said that the only person he could follow was the commander. The young lady continued to ignore him. He looked at her and asked if she had already forgotten about the battle in which she saved his life. Crave said that his devotion to her was stronger than death. Crave asked angrily what kind of marriage this was, if he was her #1 priority. He said he could see she was trying to be weak and vulnerable to match her current status, but he still wanted her to bring his cool commander back. Crave continued to say something, but she didn't listen to him. Her ears were already hurting from his voice. She wanted him to eat quickly and get lost in the fog. The young man, in turn, was very angry. He asked in a dull voice, how did her vow to always be with them? He came closer to her and asked why she was behaving like that, calling her commander Arna. Suddenly recoiled. She was furious at his assertiveness. She looked at him and with fury told him to shut his mouth and go home. She said that her uncle would be going back soon, so he could go with him. Crave, with tears in his eyes, pulled her by the hand and asked permission to be her servant. He said that he was an excellent worker. The young lady, in turn, did not listen to him and told him not to talk nonsense. A moment later, they suddenly froze as they saw the Duke slowly approaching them. But the Duke, in turn, saw a completely different picture of their quarrel. He was furious looking at his wife. He kindly and restrainedly asked what was going on. The Duke gave his wife a cold look and asked what she was doing in such a place, and alone. Arnie was scared. She didn't know what to answer him. She didn't understand when he had even arrived, since she hadn't noticed his approach. She remembered that Crave was still next to her. She was in shock. She didn't know what to do now. The young lady hesitated. She did not know what to think of and answer her husband. The Duke smiled and said that in front of him was a servant whom he was seeing. For the first time, Arna laughed and said that this was true. A moment later, she ran away and looked at her husband in surprise. The Duke looked at his wife and said that he did not think that the maid served in their castle. The young lady timidly looked away from him and said that the maid came with her, and from the Western Empire most likely. She looked at the young man and thought that he most likely looked very much like a servant. The Duke smiled and said that now everything was clear to him. The young lady was in shock. She wondered if he would really leave everything like this. Crave smiled respectfully and said that he would leave them. Arna, in turn, saw the maid off with a smile, but in her thoughts, she was ready to kill him. The Duke watched the maid closely. Crave left them in a hurry, but he knew his disguise was top-notch. He was pleased that the Duke himself did not suspect anything, and everything went as it should. But still, he remembered the expression on the Duke's face. He was puzzled and wondered why he saw such a contrast. Crave wondered if he had misunderstood everything. The young lady, in turn, watched her husband closely. She saw his detached gaze. The young lady came closer to her husband and asked if he was angry. The Duke looked at her in bewilderment, and the young lady timidly said that she thought he was angry. Cassian looked at the young lady and asked if she had a secret conversation with the maid. Arnie was shocked that he thought so. She said that it was not like that at all. The Duke smiled and said that this was very good, and he believed her. The young lady sighed heavily. She felt relieved. Herzen looked at his wife and asked if she thought the maid was strange, because she had a lot of muscles and looked more like a man. Arna, puzzled, said that she didn't even know. The Duke said that it was somehow impolite to doubt a person's gender based on their appearance, and Milady timidly said that she had said that it was true. She looked closely at her husband and wondered if the disguise had really worked, but she still didn't like the look on his face. A moment later, the Duke said that he had thought about it before. When she goes into her thoughts, then her eyes are very beautiful. She looked at him in bewilderment. She asked if what he was saying was true, since many were afraid of her, and said that she had the look of a killer. The Duke asked tenderly what sense it made in him to lie to her, and he said that he really thought so. The brutal red-eyed killer, the executioner of Levelgos, was always treated as a cursed monster, with red eyes and red blood. The young lady looked at her husband with a piercing gaze, and said that since childhood, people were afraid to look her in the eyes, and said that it was like a family curse. She said that only one person per generation was born with such eyes, and her grandfather and uncle were red-eyed swordmasters. The young man thought for a moment and asked if her uncle was that hero. He asked if it was her uncle who had captured the terrible dragon that had awakened 30 years ago, and if it was he who had ended the war with the Eastern Alliance 10 years ago. The young lady said with a smile that it was true. She knew that her uncle was indeed called the Dragon Slayer, but she was the one who ended the war with the Eastern Alliance. She was a little surprised that the rumors were different. Arna said with a smile that her uncle was a very good man. She was surprised and did not understand why he laughed unexpectedly. She called him by his title. He looked at her with bewilderment and asked what she called him. Arna looked at him with bewilderment, as she did not understand what was wrong. He smiled a soft smile and said she could call him darling. The young lady was shocked. She looked at him and asked what he was talking about. She was very confused because she had never even uttered such words in her life. The Duke looked at his wife with a soft smile and asked if he could call her by name. He came closer to her and said that she could also call him by his name. The young lady looked at the floor in embarrassment, and a moment later she called out his name. He came closer to her and gently stroked her head Arna looked at her husband with embarrassment. Without looking away, he smiled and said that she was smart. Some time later, the Duke walked into his office, thinking about his beautiful wife. He remembered his wife, who could not utter a word, and explain who that maid really was. He understood that judging by her reaction, that person was not dangerous. The Duke thought that his capture could be postponed until next time and interrogated later. Crave looked at the commander with a smile and asked if she had called him. The young lady was puzzled, as it had been 2 days since he had been walking around like that. She was shocked, but no one suspected anything. She was confused and wondering if she was the only one who thought this was weird. She looked at him and called out. A moment later, the young man's expression changed, and he stood at attention and looked at the commander. She looked at him and told him to immediately explain what had happened. Crave looked at the commander and said that ever since she announced her wedding and left, the Knights of the Golden Order began to rebel, because in the order, they are all like 2 peas in a pod. He said that they joined the order to be with the commander, but then unexpectedly for everyone, the commander disappeared. He said that there was no longer a reason why they came to the order, and therefore they could not remain calm. The young lady was puzzled. Crave smiled and said that he was the first to resign. She sighed heavily, as she thought that he was more adequate than the others. She knew she should have told them all earlier that this marriage was only for 3 months. Crave said he had met Ergen by chance when he was writing his resignation letter. He said that it turned out that he was also going to leave the order. The young lady, gritting her teeth, told him not to speak about it so carelessly. Arnie was very angry, as everything was not going as she wanted. For a moment, Crave thought and frowned. A moment later, he saw the maid standing behind the door, her gaze boring into his. Erica looked at them with tears in her eyes and screamed she was very scared. The young lady was shocked. She wondered how long the maid had been watching them. Crave gave the young maid a stern and angry look. Crave looked angrily at the defenseless maid and said that as far as he could tell, this maid was annoying the commander. He said with fury that they would deal with her slowly. Arna was shocked. She quickly asked what he was planning. She saw his stern face. The young man came closer to the door and threw it open with all his might. He looked angrily at the young maid. He looked at her and said with fury that Her Majesty the Duchess had already found herself a devoted servant. He said that she could try to take that place in another life. Erica was shocked and very scared. She started crying very loudly. She ran away with tears in her eyes and screamed at the Duchess. She did not understand how she could do this to her. Crave closed the door with lightning speed. The young lady looked at him intently. She was shocked by what happened. The young man smiled and asked what she would say. He was very happy and pleased with himself. The young lady looked at him intently. She wanted to make sure to send him home with his uncle. Crave looked at his mistress and said with a smile that the tea was ready. The young lady was shocked but did not answer. A moment later, she looked at him with a deep gaze and said that she wanted to be alone. She asked if he could leave. He smiled and said that she would soon be going to the capital, so she would need a servant like him. There was one process through which married aristocrats had to go unconditionally. Their marriage had to be approved by His Majesty the Emperor. This was a means of resolving family disputes in the name of the emperor and of declaring the rights of succession of aristocrats. The young lady knew that in their current days, this was just a formality. A moment later, she saw a whole crowd of maids. The head maid looked at the young lady intently and asked if she could speak to her. The young lady was shocked. She saw their stares and wondered if they realized that her maid was a man. She thought it was all strange that they only noticed it now. Arnie came closer to them as the body and everything explained. But a few minutes later, Erica shouted to the Duchess and said that this was too much. The young lady was in shock. She didn't understand what she had to do with it. Erica said with fury that they were the first to serve her. She said that the young lady had suddenly become close to this maid, and they were all very upset. Erica asked the Duchess if she really liked the maid, because she was also from the Western Empire. They shouted that they would also go to study in the Western Empire if only she would give them a chance. Crave froze in shock. The head maid said that this was what all the girls were complaining about. She told the Duchess that it would be unfair to favor only one maid. Arnie was shocked by everything that was happening. She thought it was just madness, since they were jealous of her and Crave, because they seemed to be close. The Duchess smiled and said that she thought there had been a misunderstanding, and she was not trying to single her out in any way. She looked at everyone present, and with a soft smile said that she loved them. All the maids were shocked by such sincerity of their mistress. They asked with smiles, "If it was true, you said that they loved her, young lady. You in turn wanted it all to end as soon as possible." A few days later they prepared to leave for the capital. The Duke looked at his wife and said with a smile that he would just go and say hello, and that she had no need to worry about him. He came closer to her and tenderly took her hand. She looked at him in bewilderment. He came closer to her and kissed her hand tenderly. She looked at him shyly. The Duke smiled and said that they would not see each other for some time. Cassian looked at his wife and said that he would come as soon as he had completed all his accumulated affairs. She looked at him and timidly said that because of her uncle, she would go first. The Duke said that he would go after her. A moment later, he tenderly pulled her closer to him and kissed her. She froze in bewilderment. Cassian smiled and said that if she missed him, she would still need to be patient for a little while. The maids were shocked by such a display of tenderness, and they looked at their masters with embarrassment. They were shocked and very happy as they saw that the Duke and Duchess had a very close and warm relationship. Crave looked intently at Duke Sarno and called him. The Duke said with a smile that he had been waiting for them for a long time. He was glad that they had finally arrived. Eva smiled and said, "Sir Crave, very remarkable." The young lady sighed heavily and said that with such persistence, he rose to the rank of deputy commander. The young lady thought for a moment. Since this was her first time traveling by carriage, she was used to riding a horse herself. Arna thought that this was even good, since she could look around. She remembered their farewell kiss. Arna was perplexed, because for some reason her heart began to beat very hard after the memories. She was in shock and wondered what she was even thinking about right now. She decided to push all thoughts away. She understood that she was simply not used to measured money. She only did what she was tormented by stupid thoughts. Lately, a moment later, their carriage began to shake. She heard someone shout that it was an ambush, and arrows flew at them from all sides with lightning speed. Crave, in turn, shouted furiously to protect the crew and His Excellency and Her Highness. He shouted for them to protect the Duke and Princess with their lives. He was in shock, as he knew it was simply unthinkable, but he still shouted for them to hold their ground. He knew something like this could happen as soon as he arrived in the Northern Empire. The Duke, in turn, sat quietly in his office and played a board game for a moment. He frowned. His subordinate asked in bewilderment what had happened. The Duke said that the pieces were mixed up today. The Duke was puzzled and wondered what this could mean. A moment later, a servant burst into his office and said that they had a problem. In the confusion, he shouted and informed everyone that the Duchess's crew had been attacked. The Duke was shocked. He couldn't believe what he heard. He didn't expect anything like that. The Duchess watched closely what was happening. She heard someone shout that a smoke bomb had been thrown. She knew they were in danger. Erica said, in a trembling voice, that she would protect the Duchess. The young lady looked at her maid and asked for forgiveness. The maid looked at her mistress with bewilderment and tears in her eyes and asked why she was asking for forgiveness. A moment later, the Duchess struck her maid and she fell down unconscious. The young lady slowly got out of the carriage, but the knight said that it was dangerous for her to go outside. With lightning speed, she hit him and knocked him out. She sighed heavily and said that she would still have to tinker a little. A moment later, a magical portal appeared near the Duchess. With lightning speed, she pulled her sword, Nevermore, out of the circle. The servant shouted to the master not to drive the horse too fast, as it might throw him off. The Duke did not listen to him, as his thoughts were busy. He thought about his wife and hoped that she was safe. He was in shock because he was worried about someone. He wondered if it was because he could lose his useful voice, or if there was another reason for it. A moment later, Crave was stunned and stood frozen in place after seeing the Duchess. There are two legendary swords in the world, from the House of Level goes. The one the young lady is currently fighting with is the one that absorbs souls, the infamous sword Nevermore. Arna, in turn, easily repelled attacks and destroyed opponents. Crave knew that it was these swords that had turned the tide of the battle. He knew that their commander was simply awesome. The young lady looked in surprise at the knight who blocked her blow. The knight in turn was trembling. He was in shock and knew that he needed to run. The young lady dealt him a mortal blow. In rage, she asked for forgiveness, but she knew that she could not let him go alive. A moment later, she sighed heavily, and at the same time there were corpses lying around her. The sword said with fury that she was just an ugly woman. He did not understand how she could call him. Only now he said that she had not called him for a long time, and now she was exploiting him like a slave. The young lady sighed heavily. He had tired her of his chatter. Opening a portal, she threw him there. The sword was furious. He screamed at her not to throw it. Crave walked up to the commander, puzzled, and called her. She looked at him in bewilderment. He said that they should have left at least one alive so that they could find out who sent them. The young ladies sighed heavily, as she had forgotten about this. A moment later she said that if necessary, they would show themselves. A moment later, the knights approached them and asked them if she was okay. Arna and Crave froze in shock. The knights asked in confusion if the Duchess was outside because someone had tried to kidnap her, but the young lady hesitated, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, they saw the Duke arriving at their side. The Duke stepped onto the ground with a depressed expression on his face. The young lady looked at her husband with bewilderment, as she did not understand his expression. He came closer to her. Arna was a little puzzled. As he looked at her intently, she was alarmed by his expression. The Duke, with the speed of lightning, hugged his wife tightly. She froze from shock and her heart beat very strongly. The Duke looked tenderly at his wife and said that it was very good that he followed her, just in case he asked if she was hurt. The young lady became embarrassed and said that she was fine. The Duke saw that she had blood on her face. He looked to the side and saw many corpses that were everywhere. He looked away and asked angrily who had done this to her. The young lady froze in shock. She understood that he must not, under any circumstances, find out that she had caused a stir. Duke Sarno approached them and said that he would explain everything. The young lady was perplexed. The Duke said that her niece's savior was right in front of them. He said that Arna was almost kidnapped, and the destruction of the enemy was due to Sir Crave. Crave was shocked by what he heard. He froze in place and did not know what to say. Arna, with their lightning speed, said that there was an attack, and he alone scattered all the bandits. The young man looked at the commander in amazement, because he did not understand why she said something like that. The Duke looked at the knight with indignation and asked if he had really defeated them all alone. He could not believe their words. The young man looked back and hesitated, because to tell the truth, he did not know what to answer. He wanted to tell the truth. But a moment later, he looked at his commander, and her eyes told him that if he even uttered a word, he would die immediately. A moment later, he said with a smile that he had done it all himself, since he knew it was better to say so than to incur the wrath of his commander. At that time, in the capital of the Northern Empire, everyone was discussing the Duke and Duchess. They said that the young people met by chance and fell in love each other at first sight. The woman smiled and told her companion that no one could have imagined that the Duke would marry a princess from the Western Empire. The man looked at his companion in bewilderment and asked what would happen to Lady Haley now. He said that the young lady was now walking around as if she had fallen into despair, and they felt sorry for her. They also discussed how His Majesty would react to this situation. The young lady looked at the beautiful and huge mansion with surprise. The Duke in turn was worried about his wife, and for this reason followed her. The butler looked at the newlyweds and greeted them with a smile. The Duke looked at the butler and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. and also greeted him. A moment later, the Duke looked at his wife and introduced the butler. The Duke said that he would show her the estate, and she could take a walk and recover from what had happened. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment. At the same time, the Duke was sitting in the palace of the Emperor of the Northern Empire. He looked at the Duke and said he didn't think they were common robbers. He asked if anyone had been hurt. The Duke said with a smile that everything was fine. He himself knew that everything was not so. A moment later, he said angrily that he had already guessed who was behind this. Duke Sarno was furious. He didn't understand how they could do this to them. Cassian patted him on the shoulder and told him not to worry. Cassian came closer to him and told him not to worry because his wife was also dear to him and he would sort everything out. The Duke was very worried and did not know if it was right to send his niece to such a man. He thought that Cassian could be involved in a big conspiracy and became a scapegoat. The Duke sighed heavily. He knew that if something went wrong, his niece would kill everyone and return home. But still in turn, he hoped that their marriage would still be strong. A moment later, His Majesty's assistant said that the Emperor had granted him an audience and he could go to him. The Duke said with a smile that this was simply wonderful, since he was already beginning to worry that he would soon be thrown out of the castle. The Duke knew that he had to do what he came for. The man looked at the Duke in bewilderment and, asking for forgiveness, asked what he was doing. The Duke smiled and said that he could not come to the meeting with the Emperor of the Northern Empire empty-handed. It was a bribe, and at the same time, a request to take care of Arna, and at the same time, stern warnings that they will not sit idly by if something happens to her. At the same time, the young lady slowly looked around the estate, accompanied by the butler. She was in shock and very tired. But despite his fatigue, the young butler continued to show her the estate. Arnie was terribly tired of everything, and she wanted to get away from him as quickly as possible. The butler said with a smile that he had told her a short story, and if she had any questions, he could answer them. The young lady said with lightning speed that she had 0 questions and understood absolutely everything. He looked at her and asked if it could be considered that she had mastered the interior decoration of the house. The young lady said that it could certainly be considered so. The butler smiled and told the young lady that in that case she could rest. Arna lay down on the bed and sighed heavily. She was very glad that she was finally free from everything. But a moment later she heard someone knocking on the door of her room. She was furious, as she had not had a moment's peace. With the speed of lightning, she sat up on the bed. Crave entered her room and greeted her with a smile. Arnie was very angry because she wanted to rest. She looked at him and asked why he came. He smiled and said that of course he came to stay with her. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he had come without a maid's costume this time. The young man was surprised by such questions and asked if she was upset. Arnie looked at him angrily and asked him why he thought that he smiled and said that she didn't have to pretend. The young man looked at his commander and said that he would like to talk to her about her husband. She looked at him in bewilderment. He looked at her indignantly and asked why such a handsome and famous man would marry her. She furiously told him to shut his mouth and also said that she would like to know the answer to this question too. A moment later, the young people heard a knock on the door and froze in place as they were not expecting anyone. The young lady looked intently at the door and asked who had come to see her. The Duke, who was standing behind the door, said that it was he who had come. The young people were in shock. They looked at each other because they already knew what to do. The Duke looked intently at the door and asked his wife if he could come inside. Crave thought that he would be better off hiding somewhere, but Arna, in turn, knew that this would not work since it would only create misunderstandings. A moment later, the Duke entered her room. He was surprised as he saw the knight next to his wife. Arnie looked at us, her husband, and said that uncle wanted to tell her something, so he sent a knight. The Duke said with a smile that he understood everything, but he himself was unhappy that the knight was next to his wife. The young lady looked at her husband and asked what brought him to her. Crave was trembling with fear. He looked at his commander and saw that she did not even blink an eye. The Duke smiled and said that he wanted to tell her about tomorrow's schedule and that he also missed her very much. The lady was shocked. She wondered how he could say such embarrassing things. With a calm face, her heart started beating faster. A moment later, the nanny came in and said that she had heated up the water for bathing. She asked, puzzled, if she had disturbed them. Arnie looked at the nanny and said that everything was wrong, and she was already running. She was very glad that her nanny had come. The young lady looked sideways at her husband and said that in that case, she would hurry to take a bath. He smiled and agreed with her. Crave looked at the Duke and bowing said that in that case, he too was leaving. The knight had not yet left the room when the Duke approached him and told him to wait. Crave trembled with fear. Crave looked in bewilderment at the Duke, who went to the door. The Duke closed the door and looked at the knight with a grin and asked if he would spare him a little time. Crave was in shock. He didn't know why the Duke wanted to talk to him. He wondered if he had been exposed. A moment later, he laughed. He knew that laughter could get you out of many situations. But looking at the Duke's cold gaze, he didn't think that it would work with a halo. Crave looked timidly at the Duke and asked in a trembling voice what he wanted to talk to him about. Crave, in turn, knew that if the Duke revealed who he really was, then the commander would also be in big trouble. The Duke looked at the young man and said that he had some questions for him. He looked at him with a smirk and a threatening look and asked who he really was. Crave, in turn, was very scared. He knew that saying that he had dealt with all the thugs alone was too much. The Duke looked at the knight and said that in truth he had a rough idea of who he really was. Crave laughed hysterically. The Duke said there were two things that really interested him: his true identity and his relationship with Arna. The young man frowned and thought about this question. He could not explain to the Duke what kind of relationship he had with the commander. Crave looked puzzled and said that they were close, but it was hard to explain. He said that he had not meant to deceive him at all and apologized for not telling him about it earlier. Crave said he came here because he was very worried and anxious being away from her. The Duke frowned and lowered his cold gaze to the floor. He did not like Crave's words at all. Crave trembled after what was said. He was in shock and wondered if it really sounded like he and the commander were having an affair. Crave began to justify himself and wanted to tell him everything, but the Duke looked closely at the knight and asked if he was really the master of the sword. Crave froze in indignation. He was in shock and did not understand why the Duke asked him such a question. He looked at the Duke with fury and asked where he got that from. He did not understand why the Duke was asking him such nonsense. The Duke looked at the knight intently and said that the only one who could deal with all the thugs who attacked the carriage was the master of the sword, and no matter how much he thought, no one else but the master came to his mind. Crave, in turn, knew it was true. The Duke said that he must have secretly followed his niece because he was worried about her. The Duke greeted him with a smile in the Northern Empire. Crave thanked the Duke in bewilderment, wondering if the Duke had mistaken him for Mr. Grehan, the commander's uncle. Cassian said he could make himself at home. Crave was shocked, but thanked the Duke again. Crave was, of course, pleasantly surprised that he was confused with the great warrior, but in turn he wondered whether he now had a chance for a long and peaceful life. The young lady looked at her companion with bewilderment. She was surprised by this situation. She asked if he was pretending to be her uncle. Crave said that was exactly it. She sighed heavily and said that now was the perfect time for him to run off into the sunset once and for all. Crave screamed that he didn't want that. She looked at him and said with a smile that he really did look like her uncle. Crave was pleasantly surprised and asked with a smile if this was true and how exactly he looked like him. Arna looked at him puzzled and told him to forget what she had just said. Crave looked at his commander with a joyful smile. The young lady, in turn, was in shock. She sighed heavily because she knew that this situation needed to be resolved somehow. Her uncle had a sword more famous than himself, namely the dragon's sword Levitan. There is only one sword that can replace the greatness of the dragons. The young lady easily used her abilities and thus summoned her sword. She told Evermore to come out. Crave was in shock. He looked at his commander as if he was spellbound. The complete opposite of the Nevermore sword is evermore born of light and leading the lost soul of a warrior into the hall of valor, the sacred sword. Crave was amazed by his commander and knew that she looked very cool with the ball in her hands. Evermore asked the mistress why she called him. Only now, he asked if her feelings for him had faded. The young lady did not answer these questions. He said that she promised that she would appreciate him when they signed the contract. Arne looked at the sword and asked if it could do something for her. Arne said that no one else could do it except him. Evermore, in turn, became embarrassed. He was amazed, as it was pleasant for him to hear such things from his mistress. He said that she recognized his superiority. He asked what this special and great thing was that only he could do, and he tired Arne out terribly with his conversation. Arne pointed her hand at Crave. The sword looked at the knight in bewilderment. For a while, Crave was beaming with happiness. Arne told him to pretend to be Levitan. Evermore was shocked. He asked the hostess in bewilderment what she was talking about. He asked furiously if she really wanted him to pretend to be this simple dragon sword. He was shocked he didn't understand why she was doing this to him. Evermore shouted at Crave not to dare even touch his noble body. Young man, you in turn bowed and said that he would serve him faithfully and truly. The sword was a little surprised. The young man shouted that every morning, afternoon, and evening, he would clean it until he went blind from its shine. Evermore asked in surprise if this was true. The young lady sighed heavily and said that the young man was a master at cleaning. Evermore said that he agreed, but if he did not clean it until it shined, then he would certainly return back. Crave thanked Mr. Evermore with tears in his eyes for such a great honor. Evermore said that he could call him Levitan. Arne was very glad that Evermore could be controlled so easily. The young lady walked slowly. She was surprised, as she quickly got used to dresses. A moment later she heard someone calling her. She saw her husband, who was looking at her intently, with a smile on his face. Cassian came closer to her and pulled her towards him. Arne was surprised, and her heart started beating fast. Cassian said with a smile that she was finally looking him straight in the eye. The young lady was shocked. She looked at her husband with confusion and wondered why her heart was beating so wildly. A moment later she pulled away from him and said that they were late and needed to hurry. As they rode in the carriage, the young lady looked at everything closely. She noticed that compared to the Western Empire, everything here was much larger and more pompous. She looked at the architecture of the palace with surprise and admiration. The Duke watched his wife closely. He thought that she was very cute. A moment later, someone called him, and his face changed with the speed of lightning. The man came closer to the Duke and asked with surprise what brought him to the palace. The Duke told him with a smile that it sounded like he was somewhere he shouldn't be. The man was taken aback and frightened. He looked at the Duke and said that he did not mean that at all. The Duke looked at the servant and said that he was here to meet His Majesty. The man said that His Majesty was not feeling well at the moment, so they would most likely have to wait a little while. The young people looked at the man in bewilderment. The Emperor looked at the prince with fury and asked if he really meant to say that he had no idea what the second prince was doing. The Emperor shouted sharply at the prince and asked him if he understood that he was actually the crown prince, shouting and insulting him. Edward was furious, wondering how long he could continue to be called a pathetic nobody. The man looked at the crown prince and asked him to calm down, as he in turn was destroying everything in his path. The man told the prince that he could not behave like that in the palace, because His Highness might hear. The prince said in anger that he could listen and would now know who to fear. The man shouted at the prince and asked him to calm down, but he did not listen. A year later he told me that the Duke of Ternouge had arrived to see them. The prince froze in place and asked if this was true. The man said that it was. The prince, in turn, beamed with happiness. He did not know what brought the Duke here, as he had said earlier that due to being busy, he could not even stop by Grumium. The man said that the Duke had recently gotten married and asked the prince if he had forgotten. The prince said that of course he remembered, and only Mackenzie had been at the wedding, but he didn't even understand what to do and what not to do. The prince thought for a moment and said that he would have attended their wedding too if he had not fallen ill. Then he regretted it very much. He looked at the man and asked where his brother was now. The Duke and Duchess sat in the drawing room awaiting an audience. The Duke, in turn, knew that he had been told a lie, that the Emperor was unwell. He knew that the Emperor was now beside himself with anger, since the Duke of Sarno, sent by the Emperor of the Western Empire, was with him. The Duke knew that he must have come to threaten the Emperor with gifts for the attack on Arna's crew. He knew that the Emperor could not even think that thanks to the ballmaster, she would return alive. And now he was forced to take it out on someone, which meant that now he had their ideal crown prince under attack. The Duke found his assumptions funny and laughed out loud. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, but called her husband and called him. A moment later he turned to face her and made a serious face. Arna looked at her husband in bewilderment, as she did not understand what exactly made him laugh so much. She looked at him intently and asked when they would meet His Majesty, since they had arrived at the palace 4 hours ago. The Duke smiled a pleased smile and said that he seemed to be feeling unwell at the moment. The Duke looked closely at his wife and said that the imperial palace had a very beautiful garden, and he asked if she would like to take a little walk. Some time later, the young lady was walking slowly through the garden. She was a little surprised and did not understand why the trees in the garden were so low. She was a little upset because she wanted to cheer herself up a little and take a nap, but unfortunately, she couldn't find a suitable place for herself. She sighed heavily as she realized that she still had nowhere to rest. Immersed in her thoughts, she did not notice the person who was right behind her. The young man came closer to the young lady and began to speak. She shuddered because she was scared. Out of fear, she went into defense mode. She hit the man who came up to her from behind. The man, in turn, was very angry and did not understand how she dared to hit him. He raised his head and looked at the young lady in surprise. Arnie looked at the young man in bewilderment. She didn't know what to do. The young man looked at the young lady with surprise and confusion. He did not understand where such a beautiful angel came from in the imperial palace. She looked at him and asked if he was okay. The young man was taken aback and said that he was okay. He looked at her and, with an embarrassed smile, asked if she could tell him where such unearthly creatures as she lived. The young lady looked at him in shock and asked what he was talking about. She thought he was some kind of crazy person. He smiled and said that she was simply beautiful and asked if he could know her name. Arnie was a little puzzled and didn't know how best to ignore him. He seemed very annoying to her, and she realized that she needed to quickly run away from him. But quietly, he thought that she was probably pretending not to know his name on purpose to attract her attention as the crown prince. He sighed with a satisfied smile and said that she knew perfectly well who he was, but he in turn would like to know her name. A moment later, he heard someone calling him and turned around. Arne realized that this was a great chance to escape from him. He looked at the young lady with a smile and said that, as she could see, he was very busy. But looking back, he saw only emptiness near him. The prince was surprised as the young lady disappeared in the blink of an eye. The Duke sat in thought. He understood that it seemed the Emperor had no intention of receiving them today. He knew that there would soon be a reception at the Imperial Palace, and they could talk there. A moment later, he heard someone knocking and thought it might be his wife. But a moment later, a servant entered his room, and Cassian realized that he was mistaken. He told the Duke that the Crown Prince was looking for him. The Duke was a little surprised, as he did not expect this. Cassian was a little surprised and wondered why Crown Prince Edward was looking for him. The man timidly said that the prince was looking for him to talk. The Duke said that since he was already here, he could talk to the prince. The man looked around the room and did not see the lady. The Duke said that his wife was currently walking in the garden. The Duke looked at the man and asked if he had anything else to say. The man looked sideways at the Duke and said that she was sure he knew. But recently, there had been an increase in the kidnapping of girls from aristocratic families. Cassian looked at him intently, but said nothing. The man said that the Count of Thessalac was trying to gather information, but he was currently in trouble and seemed to need the Archduke's help. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted as the Crown Prince burst into the room and called out to his brother with a smile on his face. The Duke came closer to the man and quietly whispered to him that the Count must tell him everything personally. The Duke looked at Edward and said with a smile that they hadn't seen each other for a long time, and also asked why he was so excited. The prince sighed heavily. The prince smiled and said that he had finally found the girl of his dreams, and she was just an angel. The Duke looked at his brother in bewilderment and asked which girl they were talking about. The prince said that he met her on the way to his brother, and perhaps this is love at first sight. The Duke asked with a smile who the beautiful lady who had driven him crazy was. Edward said, puzzled, that was the whole point. He had been about to ask the beautiful lady's name, but had missed it. Edward said that he had only looked away for a moment, but she had disappeared like a mirage. He said, with a smile, that fortunately, her beauty was unearthly, so it wouldn't be that hard to find her. The Duke looked at his brother with a smile. He was wondering what kind of girl they were talking about. Edward smiled and said that it was not often that one met such a lady. Edward said with an embarrassed smile that she had dazzling silver hair and scarlet eyes. The Duke, in turn, looked at his brother in bewilderment, for he understood who was being spoken of. A moment later, Edward heard someone enter the room and turned around in a hurry. Edward cried out, not expecting to see a young lady in front of him, and he grabbed her hand. Arnie looked at the Crown Prince in fury. She did not understand what he was allowing himself to do. Edward looked at her with a smile and said that this was his angel whom he met. He did not understand how it happened that she came to him. Edward, with an admiring smile, said that this was definitely destiny. The Duke pulled the young lady closer to him. Edward looked at his brother in bewilderment, as he did not understand why he was behaving this way. Cassian said with a smile that he was a little late in introducing himself. He said with a satisfied smile that this was his wife. Edward was shocked by what he heard. He asked if this was true, and the young angel was his wife. The Duke said with a smile that everything was correct. Cassian told Edward that she was the new mistress of the Duchy of Ternugen, and she was also his daughter-in-law. Edward was shocked. He could not believe that his angel, his brother's wife, the Duke, looked at his wife and asked her to say hello, since now in front of her was his younger cousin, Edward, the Crown Prince of the Northern Empire. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise and greeted him. Edward timidly said that he was glad to meet her. Edward was shocked. He did not expect this. His heart was very painful. The Duke, in turn, was very happy. In the end, they were never able to meet the Emperor, but Arna, who had visited the palace, was completely exhausted. And as soon as she crossed the threshold of the house, she lay helplessly in the garden of the mansion. The young lady looked away in bewilderment as she heard some noise. A moment later, she saw the maids, admiring Crave, who had saved their mistress. They said he was a fine young man. Crave looked at the lovely ladies with a smile and introduced himself. He said that he was the knight patron of Her Highness, and he hoped that they would get along with him. Erica walked closer to Crave and looked at him intently. Crave was shocked because he did not want to see this servant. He knew she had been following him while he was undercover and might say something unnecessary now. Crave looked at her puzzled and asked if he had something on his face. Erica was taken aback and asked if they had met somewhere before. She was tormented by a vague doubt. Crave was taken aback by such a question, and with lightning speed, he said that they had definitely never met anywhere before. The young lady looked at him intently and said that he looked somehow very familiar to her. He smiled and said that he seemed to like her very much, and that it was a very old-fashioned approach on her part. He wondered if she would find out. Erica looked at him intently and said that it was not like that at all. She said that she had definitely seen him somewhere before, but she could not remember when it was. He was taken aback and said that she could have seen him when he arrived at the Emperor's palace. He smiled and said that they had been riding together, and he was sure that she had seen him then. Erica frowned and looked at him intently. She wasn't sure what he said. Crave laughed hysterically and said that was exactly what happened. He knew he had to get out of this faster somehow. Crave glanced sideways at his commander, her gaze saying that if he was discovered, he was dead. The young man saw the commander's angry look. He cried silently because he understood that if the truth came out, he would be in trouble. Cassian looked at his wife and said with a smile that the imperial ball would take place in 10 days. He asked how the preparations for the event were going. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment. She looked at him scared and said she was just thinking of wearing something of her own. The nanny looked at the young lady in shock. She was puzzled by her answer. A moment later, the nanny screamed and said that this would not do. Eva asked Arna if this was really what she had taught her. Eva screamed at her mistress and said that she had told her many times how scary the place was, where all the high society gathered. And if even one thing was not perfect, the aristocrats would simply laugh at her. The Duke, in turn, looked at his wife with a smile. The young lady looked at the nanny and said that her ears were already withering from her screaming, looked at the mistress in bewilderment, and asked if the condition of her ears was important now. Eva said that she would contact the Duchess immediately, but before she could finish speaking, the Duke said with a smile that he was glad that he could finally help her. Arna and Eva looked at the Duke in bewilderment, as they did not understand how he could help them. Madame greeted the Duchess with a smile and said that she was the same Agatha that Monsieur Cassian had told her about. She said that she was usually called the Marchioness of Kina. Arna looked at the Marchioness with confusion. She did not understand why she had the feeling that she was talking to her mother and not to a stranger. Arnie came closer to her and greeted her timidly. The Marchioness looked intently at the young Duchess. The Marquise smiled and said that it was very nice, and also asked if this was the greeting in the Western Empire. Arna did not know what to answer, since she was far from etiquette, but still she said that it was correct. Madame smiled and said that now she would teach her the etiquette of the Northern Empire. The Marchioness told the Duchess to repeat after her. A moment later, the Duchess greeted the Marquise with a magic sphere. The Duchess smiled and said that she called immediately after the maids told her the news. She said with a smile that it was a great honor for them, that a famous person from the Northern Empire was taking care of her daughter. The Marchioness smiled and said that it was a great honor for her that she could see the Duchess and talk to her. She told the Duchess that she had a simply wonderful daughter. The Duchess said with a smile that their Arna was indeed pretty, but she still had a lot to learn. The Marquise said that of course she would help her with this. Arna blushed. The Duchess smiled and asked to take care of her daughter, and the next time she would visit the Northern Empire, the Marquise smiled and said that of course she would do everything, and also told the Duchess that she was always welcome in the Empire. A moment later they said goodbye to each other on a pleasant note. The Marchioness turned to the young lady and looked at her intently. The young lady looked away from the Marquise, as she felt a little awkward. The Marquise smiled and told the Duchess that she didn't need to be nervous at all. Arna agreed with her. The Marquise said that she heard that the young lady was a princess from the imperial family of the Western Empire. Arna timidly said that in a sense that was true. The Marquise said that if she was from the imperial family of the Western Empire, and now had the status of Archduchess of Terneuzen, then in the Northern Empire, except for the Emperor and Empress, she could bow to no one else. The young lady in turn was very surprised, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The Marquise smiled and said that in order for her to better understand what kind of ruling family the Northern Empire was, she would do well to listen. The Marchioness said that Emperor Giuseppe had 3 children, all from different mothers, and the young lady was surprised. Emperor Giuseppe had 2 sons and 1 beautiful daughter. First, Prince Edward, His Highness, the Crown Prince, born of the previous Empress, who passed away. Second, Prince Mackenzie, born after the Emperor had one night with a maid. And Princess Cynthia was born to the current Empress Pulcheria. The princess is still very young. She is only 6 years old. The young lady thought for a moment, as she was puzzled by what she heard. She thought that after all, the imperial family was in complete chaos. The madam said that the relationship between the first and second prince was quite tense. In aristocratic families, there is also a division into the first and second heir. They are quite sensitive to the issue of inheritance. The young lady looked at the marquise with bewilderment and asked, since the first prince had no longer been designated as the heir to the throne. Madame looked at her and said, puzzled, that it was true, but still the situation was a bit controversial. Arna was a bit surprised, as she did not understand what the problem was. The marquise looked at the young lady and said she didn't think she should bother with it, as there were only a few days left until the ball. She asked the young lady if she had any suitable dresses. Arna said she would open up some of her own. The Marchioness smiled and said that the young lady spoke exactly like the Duke. She said that she knew the largest boutique in the capital, which already sews to order the best dress. Arnie sighed heavily. She was exhausted and couldn't even get up. Madam said, looking at the young lady, that her waist should be bent at an angle of 45 degrees. Arnie was in shock, as she was having a very hard time after a busy day. A moment later, she heard a knock on the door and thought it was Eve or Crave. Without rising from her chair, she told the man he could come in. The Duke entered the room and found his wife in a very interesting position. He was a little surprised, as he had never seen her in such a state before. Arnie sighed heavily. She didn't understand why she felt so bad. A moment later, she heard a noise. She saw her husband. The Duke smiled and said that it would turn out that she had fallen on hard times. He was surprised, as she really was very fragile in appearance. The young lady was shocked, as he saw her in such a disheveled state. She thought it was just a shame, turning away. She said that she was just a little tired. The Duke called his wife with a smile on his face. The young lady turned around and looked at him shyly. He smiled and asked if she could spare him some time. The young lady followed her husband. She asked puzzledly where they were going. Cassian smiled and said that they were almost there. A moment later, he said that she could now open her eyes. Opening her eyes, she froze in place without uttering a word. A moment later, she looked into the distance. She was struck by the beauty of the night sky and could not look away. The Duke looked at his wife with a smile and asked if the view was beautiful. The young lady was amazed by the beauty and could not utter a word. The Duke said that, as a child, he often came to this place alone and enjoyed the silence and the beautiful view. The young lady smiled and said that she understood him. She was amazed because she could not even imagine that he could appreciate such simple things. She thought that her husband was still much nicer than she thought. She looked at her husband with a smile and said that the stars were falling beautifully. At the same time, the Duke saw his wife in a different light. Unexpectedly for him, his heart began to beat faster. He was embarrassed. A moment later, he looked at his wife with a tender smile and said that he completely agreed with her. On the day of the reception at the Emperor's palace, the young people were chatting among themselves. The young lady looked at her companion and asked if she had heard what rumors were going around. The lady said that it was impossible to order something from famous designers. They discussed the moment when the Archduke ordered his wife's dress. A moment later, the arrival of the Archduke and Archduchess of Ternugin was announced. The young ladies looked at the Duchess with delight. They were shocked, as they had never seen such a beautiful black dress before. The young lady, in turn, was very tense, as she wanted to take off the dress as quickly as possible, as it was terribly uncomfortable. But she knew that everyone had worked hard on the dress, and she just needed to be patient. The Duke looked at his wife and called her with a smile on his face. He said that she could relax at least in this room. He smiled a radiant smile and said that she didn't have to bow to anyone here. He was pleased. He said that this was the kind of influence he had. The young lady looked at her husband with embarrassment and said with a smile that it was very good. The Duke smiled and said that the Marquise was like a godmother to him. He smiled and asked what his godmother taught her. The young lady hesitated because she did not know what to answer. She could not tell him that the Marchioness had let her in on their family chaos. Arnie smiled and told her husband that the Marchioness had told her how to greet and about the members of the imperial family. He looked at his wife in surprise and said that it seemed she knew nothing about other aristocrats. The young lady said that unfortunately this was true. He smiled and nodded, saying that he understood her. The Duke looked at the people who were near them. Cassian wanted to give her a little tour. He said that there were people from the Children Count's house near them. They have power but no reputation, so some aristocrats treat them as the newly rich. The Duke said with a smile that they would bother her because of her good reputation. The young lady looked at them with a smirk. The Duke said that in the distance there were people from the house of Borussia. The history of their house is quite long, but they do not have power in everything. Soon they will irritate her for other reasons. Arnie looked at her husband and said that while he was telling her all this, she thought about something she asked since she was an archduchess. Was there really no one with whom she needed to maintain friendly relations? He smiled and said that there were no such people. Arna was surprised and asked if it was true. Arnie came closer to her husband and asked if he was serious about this. Cassian said with a smile that he was absolutely serious. Cassian looked at his wife and said with a smile that she could decide for herself who she wanted to be friends with and who she didn't. Cassian was surprised, as he didn't think she would think such a thing, but it was still commendable. The young lady knew that anyone would be jealous if they heard something like that. She didn't know why, but she felt awkward about the situation. Arna called her husband and said that the Emperor would not be seen today either. Cassian was a little confused, since it had never even occurred to him that the Emperor would act so meanly. He said with a smile that he would not appear to His Majesty and would not grace the ball with his presence. Arnie was a little surprised and asked if they hadn't come here to say hello to him. Arna asked Cassian if he thought the Emperor was deliberately avoiding them. Cassian didn't have time to answer his wife's question when suddenly someone called him. The man shouted and called the Duke as he wanted to tell him something urgently. Cassian looked furiously at Thessalak, who kept calling him. Arna looked at her husband and said that he could go and talk to the man, and he didn't have to worry about her. She said that it was probably very urgent, and he should still go and find out what it was about. She said with a smile that she would see who she could become friends with and who it was better to keep her distance from. The Duke looked at his wife with a puzzled and embarrassed expression. As she looked magnificent, he sighed heavily and said that he would come to her soon. The servant looked at his master and said that the imperial reception had already begun. The prince sighed heavily and said that it made no difference to him. Principal, in turn, remembered the day when he met his brother's wife. Cassian looked at his wife and said that they needed to go back. The prince remembered the young lady and her beautiful name, and he was very glad that he was able to meet such a beautiful creature. The prince knew that she was his angel. He wanted to see her again. The man told his master that His Majesty would scold him again. The prince sighed heavily and said that he didn't care. The servant said that his brother the Archduke and his wife had also arrived for the reception, and he should at least greet them. The prince jumped up and asked the man what he had just said. The prince, in turn, was in a hurry to go to the reception. He heard that his angel had arrived at the reception, and he could not miss meeting her. A moment later it was announced that the prince had arrived. Entering the hall, he saw the young lady in all her glory. He was glad he found her quickly, but he was even happier that Cassian wasn't with her. He knew that he would definitely not have a second chance like this. The prince looked at the young lady with lust. A moment later, he came closer to the young lady and said with a smile that they had not seen each other for a long time. Arnie was the prince and greeted him. The prince was glad that she recognized him. He was shocked and could not believe that she greeted him like that. He wondered if she liked him too. The prince looked at the young lady and said that, to tell the truth, he wanted to tell her something he asked if he could take a little of her time. Arn looked at him intently and said that, if it was for a short time, she could talk to him. But in turn she wondered what he wanted from her. He said that they could move to the terrace for a couple of minutes. The young lady agreed with him. Arnie looked intently at the prince. She did not understand what he was going to talk to her about. The prince turned to the young lady and called her by name. Arna looked at him in bewilderment. She did not understand why he was suddenly calling her by name. Edward looked at her and asked with a smile what she thought love was. Arna looked at the prince with bewilderment. The prince said that in his opinion, love is something that is permanently imprinted on the heart. Arna looked at the prince with a surprised look and timidly said that that was true. She did not understand what he was talking about at all. The prince looked at her and said with a smile that it did not matter to him at all that she was already married, and that he himself in truth was already engaged. Arnie was confused by his words. She stood silently and looked at him, waiting for what would happen next. A moment later, the prince with a smile on his face said that he loved her. Arna, that she was in shock on the spot. Arna. She looked at the prince with rapt attention, but mentally she almost went too far. She was in shock and could not believe what she heard. The prince smiled and said that since he first saw her in the world, only she existed for him. She was shocked and thought he had completely lost his mind. She said she was married. She didn't understand how he could tell her something like that if she was married to his brother. The prince looked at the young lady and asked with a smile if true love could not be found after marriage. She looked at him with bewilderment and asked if he really wanted to have an affair with her. Edward smiled and said that it was exactly like that. He said that marriage is politics and love is romance. Arnie was in shock and didn't understand what he was even saying. She understood that she couldn't finish him off because he was the crown prince. The prince tenderly took her hand and asked why she didn't find out with him what true love was. The prince smiled and said that if she didn't want to hide their relationship, then there was another option. He said that she could divorce his brother and be with him if she wanted to. The prince said that if his bride was bothering her, then he was even ready to leave his bride for her sake. The young lady was angry. She held back with all her might. The prince reached for her hand, as if he wanted to kiss it. Arna shouted and told him to look away. The prince looked in bewilderment in the direction the lady was pointing to him. A moment later, she struck him with lightning speed. Arna knocked out the crown prince, and he fell to the ground with a crash. The young lady looked at the crown prince with disgust, and she barely restrained herself from beating him to death. The man looked at the duke with bewilderment and said that the kidnappings of young ladies were continuing, and they had no evidence at all. The victims they had found had nothing in common. He said that he was simply starting to go crazy. Quaid said the aristocrats had beefed up security, but it was no use. He said they needed to find the kidnapper and stop him before more victims appeared. Quaid looked at the duke and asked if he was even listening to him. He couldn't understand what the duke was thinking at that moment. The duke looked at Quaid and said that they could talk later. Quaid was shocked, as he was hoping to continue the conversation. The man looked at the duke with bewilderment. He did not understand why Cassian was behaving like this. Quaid looked at the duke with puzzlement and said that it was very difficult to see him in person. A moment later, the duke was distracted as he saw the crown prince and his wife walking out onto the terrace. He of course assumed that the crown prince would harbor impure feelings for his wife. Arna left the terrace and ran into her husband on the way out. Cassian was a little surprised that she was alone. He looked at her with a smile and asked where she had been. She said that she had been on the terrace. He asked if she went there alone. The young lady frowned and thought she didn't know whether to tell the truth. She thought that such a truth could separate them. Arna was a little puzzled and did not know what to do. She looked intently at her husband and told him not to be surprised and to listen carefully. The duke agreed with her and said that he was all ears. Arna said she thought his cousin needed psychological help. The duke looked at his wife in bewilderment. She said that His Highness had just confessed his love to her. Arna remembered the moment when the crown prince spoke with admiration that he loved her. Arnie, looking at her husband, said that he was the crown prince, began to say that she would only find true love through a secret affair. She asked her husband if the country would not be in danger if such a man became emperor. The Duke could barely contain his laughter. He was in shock, as he did not expect to hear something like this. A moment later, he couldn't bear it any longer and burst into wild laughter. The young lady was shocked, as she did not understand why he was laughing when his country was in danger with such an air. The lovely ladies who were watching the whole thing were a little shocked, as some of them had never seen the Duke laugh so loudly before, and they were surprised and wondered what had happened. After some time, the assistant burst onto the terrace and saw the crown prince, after which there were rumors that the crown prince was found unconscious by his assistant. Crave looked at his commander in shock and asked if the crown prince had really told her such nonsense. The young lady said that it was exactly like that. He asked in surprise if she killed him. Arnie sighed heavily and said that she simply knocked him out since he was the crown prince after all. Crave said, puzzled that it was not for nothing that there were rumors that His Highness was ill. The maids said with smiles on their faces that Mr. Crave a very remarkable knight. They admired him. They wondered if all the knights of the Western Empire were so good-natured, saying that he was simply every girl's dream. One of the maids smiled and said that the other day she was carrying a basket of laundry, and Sir Crave was passing by and helped her carry it. She said he was very thoughtful. The maid smiled and said that she was very lucky, but the young lady said that was not all. She said that Her Highness the Duchess was attacked on her way to the imperial palace. She said that a handsome and valiant knight saved the lady alone. The other maids were surprised and asked if it was true. They said that he was kind, handsome, and even had a wonderful character, and at the same time he was very talented. Erica listened to everything attentively, and she had doubts about the valiant knight. No matter how she looked at it, it all seemed very suspicious to her. She watched the knight for a while. Erica saw him say to Evermore that he would fulfill his every whim. Crave frowned for a moment as he noticed that someone was watching him. Erica hid with lightning speed as she didn't want him to notice her. The knight looked away in bewilderment. The sword shouted furiously to his knight that his mistress had already gone very far away. The knight stopped short and shouted to his lady to wait for him. Erica, in turn, knew very well that she couldn't leave it just like that and had to bring him to clean water. Crave looked at the commander in surprise and asked if the crown prince had really lost his fear to tell her such a thing. The young lady looked at him and said that everything was exactly as she had said. He asked if she had killed him. The young lady said that she had only knocked him out since he was the crown prince. The young man said that it was no wonder that there were rumors that he was sick. A moment later, the knight was taken aback as he saw a young servant girl behind a bush who was looking intently at him. Evermore asked the knight who the lady was that was constantly following him. The young man smiled and said that she was the mistress's maid. Evermore said that she was constantly staring at him and also asked if she had fallen in love with him. Crave was taken aback and said that this was not true at all. He knew the true nature of her persecution. A moment later, he noticed her next to him. Crave was shocked, as he hadn't heard her when she arrived. Erica looked at the lady and called her. Arna looked at her in bewilderment, as she did not understand what she wanted. Erica looked at the lady intently and said that she needed to tell her something. The young men tensed up as they looked at the maid. They didn't know what she wanted to say. Arna looked at her knight with a puzzled expression and asked if he could leave them for a minute. Crave hastily said that he would do everything. Crave walked slowly away from them, hoping that the maid would not tell the mistress that he was pretending to be a maid. The young lady looked at the maid and asked what she wanted to say, and also said that she was listening to her carefully. Arna made sure that the maid was not going to swear allegiance to her again. Erica looked at the young lady and said with fury that that knight was very suspicious. Arnie was shocked because she did not expect to hear such a thing. The young lady looked timidly at the maid. Erica gathered her courage, looking at her mistress. A moment later, she screamed out, hearing that the knight was breathing unevenly towards the lady. Arnie was shocked by what she heard. The maid said that the man was constantly following her around, and that he probably wanted to attract attention to himself in this way. She said that he was always talking to himself, as if he were having a conversation with a ball that he was constantly running around with, and he never left her side for a moment. Erica said that other knights did not behave like that. Erica said with tears in her eyes that the knight was following the young lady, as if he was possessed. She said that it was better to stay away from this man, or else you could send him to another place. The young lady smiled and said that she had known the knight for a long time, and that she was not in any danger. However, she said that in the future, she would try to pay more attention to this. The young lady thanked the maid for her concern. The young lady, in turn, realized that it was better to leave this misunderstanding and not pay attention to such things. The maid bowed to the mistress with tears in her eyes. She said that the mistress should not worry so much, as she would certainly protect her. The young lady thanked her maid. At the same time, complete chaos reigned in the emperor's palace. The emperor furiously asked his subordinates how they dared to act like this. He asked if they really wanted to die, every single one of them. The emperor of the Northern Empire shouted furiously that he did not believe his ears and ordered them to report again. The man with a trembling voice read the information from the document. He reported the information to the emperor that 101 people out of 101 were dead. The cause was unknown, and the operation was a failure. The emperor was furious because the best of the best were selected for the assassination. He thought it was simply unthinkable. The man looked at the emperor and told him to calm down and drink the medicine. The emperor slowly swallowed the medicine. The emperor was very angry because the young man refused the marriage he wanted to arrange and went to the Western Empire and found himself a bride. There personally met with the emperor of the Western Empire and entered into an interethnic marriage. Cassian was constantly striving for peace and mutual trade. The operator knew that this prevented him from being confronted openly. The emperor looked at the documents with fury. He knew that he should have gotten rid of the young man before this happened. He lived like a shadow, and the emperor fell for this trick. The emperor knew he had to calm down, as he would still have a chance to get rid of Cassian. The emperor knew that if the young man hid behind the shield, then it would not be difficult for his mother to get rid of the duchess. Then everything would be decided. He knew that in this case, the young man would disappear from the outside world again. The man looked at the emperor and said that there was something he needed to know. The emperor looked at the assistant in bewilderment. A moment later, the assistant came closer to the emperor and quietly whispered something in his ear. The way the assistant conveyed the information to him, the emperor became very angry. He was angry as he heard that Edward had done something wrong again. Eva looked at the young lady and asked if it was unhealthy to go out after so long. Arna was confused and wondered how this had happened. 3 days ago, Eva informed Arna that Marquise Malashinova had sent her an invitation to tea. The young lady sighed heavily and said timidly that she was too lazy to go anywhere. Eva was shocked. She looked at the young lady and asked what she was saying. Eva gave the young lady a fierce look and said that she had told her 1,000 times that personal relationships were now an integral part of her life, and she must go to whatever it took, otherwise she would immediately inform her mother of everything. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she would go sometime later. She still attended the tea party. She was in shock as everything was irritating her, and she wanted to go back as soon as possible. A few minutes later, she entered the Marquise's residence. The young lady greeted the Duchess and thanked her with a smile for her precious visit to their humble abode. The young lady smiled and simply agreed with her. Everyone present was shocked. The lady smiled and told the Duchess that she could sit down first. She warned the Duchess that the seats were assigned completely at random. Aaron walked up to the table and greeted the young lady. The lady smiled and also greeted the Duchess. Moments later, the young ladies exchanged predatory glances. The lady looked at her friend and asked if everything had gone well. That time the young lady smiled and said that fortunately everything had worked out. For some time, they carried on an informal conversation, in which the Duchess took no part. Arna felt like she was out of place for a moment, but she decided not to pay attention to it, and began her meal. The young lady looked at the Duchess with a predatory look, because she knew that the Duchess did not know that they were celebrating, so she clearly felt out of place. The other lady knew that it was not so easy to fit into high society, and they mocked the Duchess. Arna, in turn, did not pay attention to their conversations, and slowly devoured the dessert. She was in shock because she really liked the dessert, and she was even ready to cry. The young lollipops looked at the Duchess in surprise, as they did not expect such a thing. Haley was feeling as she had heard that the young lady had almost fainted at the news of the Archduke's wedding. She wondered if she had been hurt. Her interlocutor said that fortunately everything was fine, but she was taking the news very hard. Arnie did not listen to them and enjoyed her dessert. The lady looked at the Duchess and deliberately raised her voice. She said that Lady Haley loved the Duke very much and even lost consciousness. They said that she was very poor. The young lady looking at the Duchess said that this news had spread throughout all social circles. The Duchess, in turn, was intently absorbed in the beautiful dessert. Looking at it, she wondered what kind of jam was in it. A moment later, one lady cleared her throat, and the Duchess looked at her. The lady then continued talking about Lady Haley. They wanted to put the Duchess in her place in this way. Arna wondered if she should say anything. She said with a smile that it seemed like they were having a very pleasant conversation. The young lady was shocked. She wondered if this was really a pleasant conversation. In the Duchess's opinion, she smiled and timidly said that it was not like that at all. The lady thought that the Duchess should simply be kept in the dark. A moment later, they were all chatting casually among themselves and paying no attention to the Duchess. Arnie was pleasantly surprised. She wondered if all the girls weren't talking to her because they noticed that she was uncomfortable being in such a place. She thought that they were still very good and nice people. The Duke looked at his subordinate in surprise and asked if the Duchess was really having tea with the Marquise right now. The man looked at the gentleman and said that everything was correct. The Duke thought about this tea party for a moment. He knew that it would not be easy for his wife. He remembered how they were at the ball, and she said that while he was telling everything, she wondered if there was anyone with whom she needed to maintain friendly relations. The Duke thought it was very cute that she was trying her best, being so fragile. A moment later, he was distracted from his thoughts. The young man told his master that he must listen to him, as the information concerned the attack. The man said that it seemed that his guess was correct. He said that all the evidence had disappeared. He asked the Duke if they would investigate further or if they should stop investigating. The Duke looked at him and told him to investigate further until he got to the truth. He also told Alan that he was not comfortable without an assistant. For a moment, the Duke wondered if the Duchess was not on the Empress's side. The Duke knew that in social circles the Marquise of Kiena and Melashinova were fighting for influence, and he wondered whether the Marquise was planning to get on his wife's nerves. The Duke was puzzled, as he was worried about this situation. A moment later, he stood up with the speed of lightning. The servant looked at the master in surprise. The man asked the master where he was going. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he needed to meet his wife, who is now at war. The man looked at the master in surprise. The young lady sat quietly sipping her tea in silence, but suddenly she heard some noise in the distance. Turning around, she saw her husband, who was looking at her with a radiant smile. The Duke looked at his wife and said with a smile that he had come for her. All the ladies present froze in shock. They could not believe that the Duke smiled. Arna looked at everyone present with bewilderment. The young ladies admired the Duke's beauty. Arna, of course, knew that her husband was very handsome, but she did not expect such a reaction. The young lady looked at her husband intently. She wanted to be the only one who saw this smile. The Duke looked at his wife with bewilderment. Arnie sighed heavily. She didn't understand where this feeling came from. She knew that their marriage would not last long, and they would soon separate. The Duke looked closely at his wife. He noticed that she sighed heavily. He thought that tea drinking must have been a living hell for her. The Marchioness hurried up to the Duke and said with a smile that she did not know that he would come to them personally. The Duke greeted the Marquise coldly and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. The Marchioness did not expect such a cold look from the Duke and laughed hysterically. The Marquise calmed down a little and said with a smile that they had not seen each other for a long time, and that this was true, and also asked if he had really come to see the Archduchess. The Duke said with a smile that she had guessed quickly. The Duke slowly pulled his wife towards him and hugged her. Arna was surprised, as she did not expect such behavior from her husband. The Duke smiled and said that his dear wife was very shy, so he asked the Marquise to take care of his precious wife. The Marchioness burst out laughing and said that of course she would look after her. The Duke looked at his wife and said that it was time for them to go. All those present could not take their eyes off the couple. They were surprised as the Duke was very affectionate with his wife. The young ladies said that the Duke was kind to everyone, but this was on a whole other level. They envied the young Duchess. They said that Mr. Cassian must really dote on Mrs. Arne. Some time later, they were riding quietly and silently in the carriage. The Duke looked closely at his wife. He noticed that her eyes were very red. Cassian wondered if it was because of the tears. He was furious because he did not understand what had happened. The very thought that they could have harmed her simply made him sick. He knew that his wife was a dear and irreplaceable person for him. If she had not defended her status as Archduchess by now, the Emperor's effigy would have been sitting there never taking her eyes off him. He knew that his wife was the princess of the Western Empire, and even the Emperor could not act rashly. He was very worried about his wife, and the only thing that bothered him was that his gaze was always fixed on her. The Duke looked at his wife and asked with a gentle smile how she was enjoying her tea today. The young lady frowned for a moment and thought about what had happened at the tea party. A moment later, she said that it had been a lot of fun, and the desserts were simply delicious. The Duke froze in place. He was in shock. Arna looked at her husband with a smile and said that the ladies at the table had been very kind to her. The Duke looked at her in bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. He couldn't believe that they had been kind to her. She smiled and said that it was true, and they had been very polite to her. She remembered their conversations and how she had enjoyed the dessert. Arna said with a smile that while she was eating dessert, they didn't say a word to her so that I could chew in peace. She said with a satisfied smile that the people in the Northern Empire are very wonderful. The Duke, in turn, looked at his wife with bewilderment. He wondered if this was sarcasm on her part. Arna said with a smile that she was having a lot of fun. The lady plopped down on the bed, as she was very tired today. Arnie was tossing and turning all over the bed and saying that no matter who invited her, she would not go anywhere else. The next morning, the young lady stood in bewilderment. After what the nanny had told her, she looked at her and said that the beta had repeated it again. The young lady was taken aback and asked the nanny again what she had said. The nanny looked at her puzzled. But a moment later, the nanny said that Her Majesty the Empress had sent her an invitation. Eva, looking at the Duchess, said that the Empress wanted to dine in her company today. Arna was a little surprised, since it was already morning. She asked if you in the Northern Empire always make appointments so hastily. The Duchess was surprised that the Empress had sent the invitation in the morning and had simply confronted her with the fact, instead of politely asking if she agreed to come. Eva looked at the young lady and said that since she and Sir Crave from the Western Empire were denied entry into the palace for security reasons, Arna was shocked as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The nanny looked at the young lady and said that she had a bad feeling and she had better be careful. The young lady frowned. She was very angry, as everything looked very suspicious. The young lady slowly approached the imperial palace. This was already her third visit. It was not the first time she had seen the palace, but as soon as she approached it, she clearly understood how huge it was. The young lady wondered whether she would be criticized for her pompous appearance. Barney approached the maid and said that she had come to dinner at the invitation of the Empress. Erica Vuise, in turn, knew that mistakes could not be made because she was entrusted to accompany the lady as a maid of honor. Madame looked at the Duchess and thanked her for her visit. She said that unfortunately, the preparations were not yet finished, and Her Majesty the Empress was not yet ready to receive guests. Madame looked at the Duchess and, asking for forgiveness, said that she would have to wait a little. Arna was confused, as she had arrived on time and was being made to wait. She wondered if this was all done on purpose. She looked at Madame and asked how long she had to wait. Madame was taken aback, as she did not know how to answer the question asked. She timidly said that the Duchess would have to wait just a little bit. Arna looked at Madame and said firmly that in that case, she would stay here and wait. Madame looked angrily at the young Duchess, gritting her teeth. Erica was in shock. She did not understand how Her Majesty the Empress could communicate like that with the Archduchess herself. She thought that it was simply meanness on her part. The young lady stood quietly in the palace and waited for an audience. She laughed quietly as she remembered the time when she was on guard duty. She often stood for 12 hours a day. She recalled those pleasant days with a smile, but she was still interested in the question of whether an hour had already passed. The Empress looked at her assistant with fury and asked if the Duchess had really been standing there for an hour and a half already. The Empress was furious. She did not understand how the young lady dared to oppose her without knowing the reason. The insidious plan that the Empress had prepared was as follows. The Empress deliberately gave a cold reception so that the Princess of the Western Empire would be rude to Her Majesty. The Empress bit her nails nervously. She was furious because after the first stage of her plan, she was going to humiliate the Duchess. The Empress laughed and said with a sly smile that she had heard that the young Duchess was very fragile, and therefore she would not last long. The Empress wanted to see how long the young lady could last. 3 hours later, the young lady stood calmly in the same position awaiting an audience, while her maid was already tired of waiting. The Empress's assistant looked out the door and saw that the Duchess was still standing. She looked at the Empress and said that if they continued like this, she would be in trouble. Madame said that if a rumor spread that the Archduchess was being treated in such a disrespectful manner without any reason, then they would be in trouble. When the Archduke heard something like that, the Empress was furious. A moment later, looking at her assistant, she said that she could let them in. Madame came out to the Duchess and said that the Empress was ready and they could go in. Erica looked at her mistress with a satisfied and joyful look, as she knew that she was very weak, but still could stand up to the Empress herself. Erica thought that her mistress was simply an amazing person. A moment later, the young lady entered the room and saw the Empress in all her glory. The Empress in turn looked menacingly at the young lady. Arna remembered that Madame Kiena had told her that the Empress was only 2 years older than the Crown Prince. Arnie thought that maybe that was why she acted like a little wild child who didn't know how scary the world was. The young lady came closer to the Empress and greeted her with a smile, and introduced herself and also apologized for the late greeting. The Empress looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that she thought that it would be difficult for her to master the culture of the Northern Empire due to her background, but she did very well. The Empress said that she wanted to invite her like this sometime and have a leisurely chat. Yawning, the Empress said that if she had known that the Duchess would arrive at such an early hour, she would have prepared in advance. But she was very tired yesterday, so she overslept a little. The Empress said that she thought that the young lady would understand her because they both made a mistake. The young lady looked at the Empress with a puzzled expression and agreed with her. Arna could see that she was a master at making both sides look guilty. The Empress smiled and said that she had prepared lunch in a sunny place, so they could go there. When they arrived at the place, the young lady was taken aback. She was in shock and wondered how she could eat the whole mountain of dishes by herself. Arnie thought that she would most likely have indigestion. The Empress looked at the young lady with a satisfied smile and asked if she liked the food. Arnie smiled and said that everything was very tasty. The Empress looked at her intently and said that her expression said otherwise. The Empress asked the young lady if it was because she was from the Western Empire. She asked if she didn't like the food here. Arna looked at the Empress in surprise. She didn't understand what the connection was between origin and food preferences. The Empress said with a smile that she had heard it yesterday. She had been at the Marquise's tea party. The young lady smiled and said that everything was exactly like that. The Empress said with a smirk that she heard that the Archduke had personally come to take her away, and it was the first time she had heard of Cassian doing something like that. She said that he had never behaved like that with his former lover. The Empress asked with a grin if the young lady knew anything about this. Arna's son looked at the Empress in bewilderment, but did not answer. A moment later, the young lady asked the Empress if she could ask her one question. The Empress smiled and said that she could ask without hesitation. The Empress was wondering if she wanted to know about Cassian's ex. Arna looked at the Empress and said that it seemed that the aristocrats of the Northern Empire were very interested in other people's personal lives. She said that in the Western Empire, it was impolite to gossip about other people. She asked if this was really a difference in mentality. The Empress was shocked by this. She didn't expect the young lady to say something like this at all. She was furious and wondered if the young lady dared to teach her. She knew that in this case, she would not be spared. The Duke looked at everyone present in surprise and asked if the Empress had really invited his wife to her place. Eva said that as soon as the Duke had gone to the Thessalaks mansion, an invitation had arrived in the morning from the Empress herself. Eva said that for this reason the lady left for the palace, but has not returned yet. For a moment the Duke thought about this situation. A moment later, he stood up with lightning speed and said that they needed to immediately go to the imperial palace right now. At the same time, the young lady slowly enjoyed the delicious dishes. She thought that the portions were still large, but she found it very tasty. But a moment later, Arna looked at everyone present in bewilderment, as she did not understand why they had suddenly become so quiet. The Empress looked at the young lady nervously and asked with a smile if she liked the food. She wanted to teach the young lady a lesson for the words she said to her earlier. Arnie smiled, looking at the Empress, and said that everything was very tasty. The Empress said with a smile that she was very pleased to hear this, and suggested that she take a little walk in the garden, as the roses in the garden were simply wonderful. Arna looked at the Empress with bewilderment, as she did not understand what she had in mind. For some time they strolled leisurely around the beautiful garden. The Empress looked at the Duchess, and with a smile invited her to sit in the gazebo for a while. The Empress smiled and told the Duchess that she could go first. The young lady in turn agreed and slowly walked towards the gazebo, but she was overcome by a strange feeling. She quickly approached the gazebo and looked around. She did not notice her servant. She did not understand where she had gone. A moment later she heard the distinct cry of her maid and became alert. Erica, in turn, was closely watching her mistress. She was very worried because she knew that her mistress was gentle and very fragile. But suddenly someone called her. The maid came closer to her and asked her name, and the maid said that Erica should serve tea to the Archduchess. Since she was serving, Erica was taken aback and said in a hurry that she would do everything. She was very worried and trembling with fear, but she told herself that she could handle it, and she just needed to pull herself together. A moment later she was walking slowly towards her mistress, trembling. The Empress's maids looked at her with smiles. A moment later the Empress's maids exchanged predatory glances, and one of the maids stepped on Erica's foot. Erica stumbled and dropped the tray of tea, and she screamed in fear. But a moment later, the Duchess easily caught the tray of tea, and her maid. The Duchess looked at the maid and told her to watch her feet. Everyone present was in shock. They couldn't believe what they saw. They looked at the Duchess in bewilderment and wondered why she was so fast. The Empress was furious. She knew that now was not the time to admire the young lady. A moment later, the Empress asked in anger how they dared to make such a fuss in front of her. She shouted and asked what kind of bad manners they had. The Empress shouted furiously that this was simply unthinkable, and that they must fall on their faces immediately. The Empress, in turn, continued to shout and asked them if they knew where they were now and what they were doing. She asked if ladies in the Western Empire really didn't study etiquette. Erica was crying, and the young lady, Yu, in turn, wondered what she had done wrong. Erica looked at the Duchess and, with tears in her eyes, said that it was her mistake. Arnie looked closely at the Empress's maids, who silently looked down at the floor. She could bet that one of the maids had tripped her maid, since only one shoe was dirty. Arna was of course curious as to why the palace maid was shifting her work to her servant. She wondered if the Empress had really built all of this. Arnie went up to her servant and told her not to cry. The Duchess smiled and said that it was the duty of a superior to be responsible for his subordinates. Erica sobbed with tears in her eyes and looked intently at her mistress. A moment later, Erica shouted that because of her, the Duchess was about to be humiliated. The young lady, in turn, knew that the Grey Kings were obliged to bend the knee. Arna told her that she needed to go to another place first. The young lady looked at the Empress and said that they were not ordered to stay here. She said that it was better to do this at the gate of the Empress's palace than in the middle of the garden. The Duchess said that they would now kneel. Erica agreed with her, while the Empress in turn watched them with an angry look. The young lady wondered what the best way to resist the insolent man with the highest title was. She knew she just had to wait until he crossed the line. The young lady and her maid sat kneeling in front of the Empress's palace, and Arna, in turn, wondered if 10 hours would be enough for the Empress. This situation brought back memories of when she became a squire and beat up everyone she didn't like. Then she was on her knees, listening to the captain's moralizing. She sighed heavily, for her pride had kept her on her knees for 54 hours, and she remembered the good times that had already passed. The Empress looked at her assistant with fury and asked if the Duchess had really been sitting and smiling for 2 hours. The Empress looked at Madame and said angrily that she had said earlier that the Duchess was frail and good for nothing. The madam said, puzzled, that was what her sources had told her. The Empress slowly walked to the window and looked at the Duchess, who was sitting and smiling. The Empress was very angry. She knew that she had to go and end this. The man ran after the prince and shouted at him to come to his senses. The man shouted to the prince that the emperor would definitely find out about this. The man blocked the prince's path and said that he would not let him through. The prince was furious. He looked at the man and shouted at him to get out of the way, as his beloved woman was now in danger. The man looked at the prince in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about, and about which beloved woman, since he knew that the young lady was the Archduke's wife. The prince said he didn't care and pushed the man away, running towards the young lady. The emperor looked at the Empress with fury and asked what she was doing. He asked if she was really going to let the crown prince get away with all these stupid antics. The emperor asked if she really treated him like a stranger because she was not his mother, and he told her to think carefully about what this could lead to for her. He said angrily that if she continued to perform her duties in a slipshod manner, she would certainly regret it. The Empress trembled with anger. It was for this reason that she tried to teach a lesson to the Archduchess, the culprit of the Crown Prince's inappropriate behavior. But unfortunately, this had absolutely no effect. Madame turned to the Empress and said that a lot of time had passed, and if she did not intervene, there would be trouble. Madame asked the Empress if they could let her go today and teach her a lesson another time. The Empress, in turn, looked intently out of the window, but nothing answered. A moment later, a maid flew into the room and called the Empress. The madam looked at the maid and asked what was the matter. She shouted angrily at the maid and told her to behave decently in front of the Empress. The maid asked for forgiveness. But a moment later she said that His Highness the Crown Prince had come to see the Empress, and the Empress looked at the maid in bewilderment. The Crown Prince slowly approached the young lady. He was trembling. The prince came closer to the young lady and saw her face filled with pain. He was in shock, as his heart had never been torn apart by pain so much. He looked at the young lady with tears in his eyes and wondered if this was what they called the pain of love. The crown prince came closer to her and knelt before the young lady. Arna looked at him with bewilderment, as she did not expect to see him. The prince extended his hand to her, and with a gentle smile, told her not to cry, and at the same time he called her little bird. The prince looked at the young lady with tears in his eyes, and trembled. He told her not to cry. Arna looked at him in bewilderment, because she hadn't cried at all. She was in shock. She didn't understand why he called her a bird. The prince trembled, and said that he would certainly talk to the Empress, and she would be pardoned. With tears in his eyes, he said that this was all he could do to help her. A moment later, the Duke came up to them, and said that the prince had no need to ask for it. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise, as she did not expect to see him. The Duke came closer to them, and looked intently at his wife. He smiled at her with a gentle smile, and holding out his hand, told her to hold his hand. She was pleased, but still, she said that the Empress had ordered her to kneel. She asked if she would not anger her if she stood up now. A moment later, the Duke sat down next to his wife. He looked at her intently, and said that the Empress's anger was not a problem. Taking his wife's hand, he kissed her tenderly. The Duke smiled, and said that his wife's well-being was more important to him. The prince was shocked, as he had witnessed such a scene. A moment later, a maid approached the young people, and said that the Empress had said that they could leave. The maid looked at the prince, and said that the Empress would like to discuss something with him. The prince looked at the maid in bewilderment, as he did not understand why the Empress wanted to talk to him. The maid said that he needed to go to her quickly. The prince was taken aback but still agreed. The duchess looked at her maid, and said that there might be a rise. Erica, you in turn, were very happy about it. Trying to get up, Erica screamed as her knees were bleeding, and in great pain. The Duke and Duchess looked intently at the maid, saying nothing. The Duke thought that, of course, after several hours of sitting on his wife's lap, it would be difficult to stand. The young lady was confused. She did not know what to do, since she could not just up and stand up. A moment later, the Duke, with lightning speed, lifted his wife into his arms and smiled at her with a sweet and gentle smile. The Duke smiled and said that she only needed to be patient for a little while, as her legs must be in terrible pain. The young lady was taken aback, as he was too close. She timidly said that it was. The Duke looked at the doctor and asked how his wife was, that the Duchess was now taking a bath after going on vacation, but after today, all her knees were covered in abrasions. The doctor said that there were small scratches and swelling on her legs, and the Duchess should refrain from exertion, since due to the strain she could remain lame for the rest of her life. The Duke shuddered. He was very angry. The doctor said that he would give the maid some ointment to the Duchess. The doctor said that if you use it for a couple of days and rest, then there won't even be a scar left. The Duke looked at him and asked if it was necessary to just smear it on. The doctor looked at the Duke in surprise and said about the task, which is true. The doctor asked the Duke if he wanted to apply it himself. The Duke nodded and confirmed. A moment later, the Duke entered his wife's room. The young lady was surprised, as she did not expect to see him. The Duchess looked at her husband and asked where her nanny was. Arna said that Eva should help her with the treatment, and also asked her husband why he came. The Duke looked at his wife and asked her to show him her knees so that he could apply the ointment. The young lady looked away from her husband in embarrassment and said that he was not obliged to do this. The Duke came closer to his wife and, kneeling before her, asked if he could do this. The young lady was embarrassed. She understood that she had no chance to resist, since he used his beauty too skillfully. The young lady timidly said that he could do it. She lifted the hem of her dress and showed him her knees, which were covered in bruises. The Duke was shocked. He looked at his wife with a sad face and said that it would hurt a little. The young lady nodded in agreement. She intentionally injured herself as soon as she arrived at the estate, so as not to be different from Erica. She knew that she needed to stop hurting herself, because her conscience would one day torment her to death. The Duke looked at his wife and called her. He asked if he could ask her one question. The young lady looked at her husband with embarrassment. and said that of course he could ask. The Duke asked her why she accepted the punishment when she could have simply returned to the estate and refused the punishment. The young lady hesitated and timidly said that she was afraid that he would get into trouble. Cassian looked at his wife with embarrassment and said that from tomorrow onwards, he would make sure that the imperial family would never dare to do such a thing to her again. The man waved off the secret visitor and said that if they printed something like that, they would be finished. He said that he had no idea who he really was, but they could not print such dangerous news. A moment later, the man saw a bag in front of him. He asked in surprise what it was. The young man said that it was an advance, and if the man published the news, he would pay twice as much. The man was shocked because he saw a suitcase of money in front of him. The young man went to the door and told Dominic to decide quickly. Dominic in turn was shocked. He asked the young man who he was and how he knew him. The young man sighed heavily as he left the room. He was glad that everything went as it should. A moment later, he contacted the Duke and said that he had carried out his orders. The Duke, with a grin, said that he was looking forward to tomorrow. Early in the morning, everyone was shocked by the news they read in the newspaper. They could not believe that the Empress did this to the Duchess. Sometime later, everyone in high society was discussing the Empress's actions. They could not believe that she could do something like that. The men also discussed this incident, how they could not believe this incident. They said that even though the Archduchess was from the Western Empire, the Empress still should not have acted like this. The Emperor read the news and was furious. He smashed everything in his path. He could not believe how they dared to publish this news. The Emperor tore up the newspaper and asked in a stern voice if they really wanted to die for insulting the imperial family. The servant approached the Emperor and asked him to calm down a little. The Emperor looked at him with a dull expression and asked if he would really be calm in his place. He ordered the servant to immediately close this publishing house. The publishing house published an interesting article about how the Empress severely punished the Archduchess. The publishing house wrote that the Empress hated foreigners, and after this situation, all the Archduchess's legs were covered in bloody abrasions. The servant said that they were slowly contacting the appropriate authority. The man said that the Emperor of the Western Empire sent a letter through the wizard tower. The Emperor was shocked because he did not expect such a thing. The servant said that His Majesty was very saddened that the Archduchess had suffered and would not remain silent if this happened again. The Emperor was furious. The Emperor angrily hit the table and said that this was definitely Cassian's doing. The Emperor knew that he could not let him get away with this. The young lady sat quietly and sipped tea while talking to her mother. The Duchess told her daughter that this news had brought them all into incredible shock, and her father had rushed home in tears. The young lady looked at her mother in bewilderment and asked if her father had really been crying. The Duchess said that her father had almost come after her to bring her home, but she had managed to calm him down, and His Majesty had been furious too, so they had sent a letter of reproach through the wizard's tower. The young lady asked in surprise if they had sent a letter to the Emperor of the Northern Empire himself. The Duchess said that of course they had. Arna said in bewilderment that they had only wasted their time since nothing terrible had happened. The Duchess asked her daughter how her son-in-law was doing. Arna said that she thought the publication was his doing. She remembered how he had said last night that he would make sure that the imperial family would never dare to treat her like that again. The young lady, of course, did not expect that her husband meant exactly this. The Duchess looked at her daughter with a smile and asked if this was true. The Duchess said with a smile that it was her son-in-law, and she also said that, of course, he would not just let her be treated like that. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she doubted that it was worth getting so excited about. The Duchess asked if it was because everyone was actually having fun and looked at her mother in bewilderment. Arna thought for a moment, as she did not understand why the Empress wanted to meet her. She said that she thought the Empress was trying to disgrace her by humiliating her maid. Arna said that her maid would have faced an extremely serious punishment if she had not helped her. The duchess clapped her daughter and said that her daughter was absolutely magnificent, and also told her not to dare slow down. The young lady looked at her mother in bewilderment and said that if she did, that people would understand that she was not so fragile. The duchess said that once everything was revealed, they would somehow survive, since she raised her to be strong and not a houseplant. The duchess said with a smile that the most important thing was that no one recognized her as a swordmaster, and the rest could be fixed. The young lady smiled and said that no one would know for sure. And the duchess asked with a smile where her son-in-law was. Arna thought for a moment and said that he seemed to have gone to the palace. The servant looked closely at the duke and sighed heavily. He said that His Majesty was furious, but still decided to turn a blind eye to everything that was happening. The man said that since the Empress had done wrong, but next time he would not be so lenient. The man told the Duke that he should bow at the feet of the Emperor. Cassian said with a smile that it seemed he would not be able to see the Emperor today. The man looked at the Duke in bewilderment and asked if he was really trying to provoke the Emperor. The young man smiled and said that he was simply using all the means available to him. The man looked at the Duke sullenly. He sighed heavily and said that this was all he was instructed to tell the Duke. Cassian turned around and thanked him for his efforts with a grin. The man looked at the Duke with bewilderment and asked where he was going. Cassian said with a grin that he still had unfinished business in the palace. The Empress read the news and trembled with anger. She knew that the Emperor would shake the soul out of her again. Later she was informed that the Archduke of Terneuzen had come to visit her. The Empress was shocked as she did not expect to see him. Madame looked at the Empress and asked if she needed to tell the Archduke that she was busy. The Empress looked at the door with fury. She understood that there was no other choice, and she had to meet him. She told her maid to let him in. Cassian slowly entered the Empress's chambers. He wanted to talk to her. The Empress looked at the Archduke with puzzlement and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. The young man looked intently at the Empress and said with a smile that they really hadn't seen each other for a long time. The Empress smiled and thanked him heartily for the pleasure he had given her with his visit. The Empress looked at him and said that he could sit down first. Cassian slowly pushed the chair back and saw a photograph on the table. Cassian looked at the photograph with a grin and told the Empress that his daughter was quite a cute child. He said that she was very young and beautiful. The Empress trembled. She looked at him and asked what he was talking about. Cassian gave the Empress a grin and said that she must have learned to write and read by now, and it would be a shame if she got her hands on today's newspaper. The Empress was shaking with anger. She looked at him and asked if he was threatening her. Cassian looked at her with anger and said that he was upset by her words. He said that he was just reminding her that she would have a very hard time if they ended up on different sides. He looked at her and said with a smirk that this was the first and last warning. Cassian looked at her with a cold gaze and told her not to interfere with the people he cared about. In the Western Empire, the Emperor was enjoying a beautiful day. With a smile on his face, he was very pleased. The Duke looked at the Emperor and puzzled said that he was in a very high spirits today. The Emperor smiled and said that it seemed like the world itself was in his favor. He said that he couldn't believe that the Northern Empire had insulted them so much. He said that they no longer had to worry about losing Arna. The Duke looked at his brother and asked if he had given his consent to the marriage, only because Arna would not stay there for long. The Emperor thought for a moment and said that he did it more because of Rosalia's persuasion. The Duchess came to the Emperor and said that she dared to ask His Majesty for a small favor. The Duchess asked him to help her find a husband for her daughter. The Emperor looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted to marry Arna off. The Duchess said that, of course, she wanted to do this, since first of all, her daughter was a person, not a knight. The Duchess said that her daughter had been devoted to him since her youth and had defended the empire. She asked him to give her daughter a chance to find her love in this life. The Emperor knew that it was due to Arna's service that their empire received such honor. The emperor sighed heavily and told his brother not to worry. The emperor knew that his niece would return home, no matter what it cost her. He knew that Arna was a noble lady and had a strong character. The emperor said that 3 months was a long time for her, and he could bet that the young lady would return in a couple of weeks. The emperor laughed, and the duke looked at him puzzled. The marchioness, in turn, taught the young lady all the rules of etiquette. The marchioness looked at the duchess and said that the steps for the ladies' party were very simple. The young lady, in turn, only laughed. She wanted to leave as soon as possible. The marquise looked at her and said that now she herself must imagine that she was at a ball. Arna tried to repeat everything that the marquise showed. Her madame looked at the duchess and said that she should do it again, as she was doing everything wrong. Eva was shocked. She thought that the lady needed to study in the Western Empire. Crave smiled and said that she was simply hopeless. The marchioness said that it seemed her mother had spoken the truth, for she had informed her that owing to her poor health and natural fragility, she had received little training in the ways of a lady. Arna said that everything was exactly like that, but she actually knew how it was. The marchioness smiled and told the duchess not to worry, as she had her, and the young lady would learn everything quickly. Arna, puzzled, thanked the marchioness. A moment later, the young lady noticed her husband, standing and laughing quietly. She was surprised and did not wonder how long he had been standing there. The duke smiled at his wife and asked for forgiveness. He said that it was funny to watch her try. The marchioness looked at him in surprise and asked if he was going away somewhere. The duke said that he was, since he had an appointment. The duke smiled and thanked the marquise for taking care of his wife. The marquise smiled and said that it was her job. Arna, in turn, was very embarrassed and hoped that he would simply leave silently, without a single word. A moment later, the duke looked at his wife and called her. She looked at him in surprise. Cassian asked with a smile if she really wouldn't tell him anything. Arna hesitated timidly and wished him a safe journey. He looked at her in surprise and asked if that was all. She looked at her husband in bewilderment, as she did not understand what else she should say. Cassian pulled her closer to him and kissed her tenderly. She was surprised. He said he hoped he would get the same from her next time. Cassian looked at his wife and said with a smile that he would be back very late today, so she didn't need to wait for him and could just go to bed. Madame looked at the newlyweds and said with a smile that they looked very wonderful together. The duke smiled. Arna sat in her room in the evening and thought about the fact that her husband had left the estate for such a long time, for the first time, which did not give her any peace. But a moment later, she thought that she was winding herself up for nothing. A few minutes later, she heard some noise. Arnie walked closer to the window and looked down. She saw a knight shouting that they had knocked out another one. The knight looked at his comrade and said that it looked like someone suspicious had broken into the estate, and the number of guards needed to be increased. The young lady stared out the window. She didn't know who they meant, but a moment later she heard a strange noise behind her. The man struck the young lady with lightning speed, but she managed to dodge it, and only a small cut was left on her neck. The man looked at the young lady and asked if she was the princess of the Western Empire. Meanwhile, the duke was sitting in the Cillian Club. He looked at Alan and welcomed him to the capital. Alan looked at the duke and said that the knight Rashaelis had returned, and he must have already arrived at the estate. The duke said that he understood him and also asked if there was any other news. Alan looked at the gentleman and said that he had previously ordered him to find out about the attack on the Archduchess, but the only witness to the attack died. The duke asked him if he had really found the body. Alan said that was true. He asked if he should continue investigating based on all this. The duke sighed heavily and said that they would leave it at that. The only reason he ordered an investigation was because of the suspicious knight who said that he did everything. The Duke of U, in turn, wanted to find out more information about Crave. The Duke wondered if he was making too much of a big deal out of little things, and Alan looked at the gentleman darkly and said that he had received information that he wished to impart. The Duke looked at Alan sullenly and asked what new information he was talking about. Alan said that their spies in the Western Empire had discovered that something strange was going on in the knightly order of the Golden Dragon. The swordmaster and the commander of the order suddenly disappeared, and this even reached the ears of their spies as the knights of the order went on strike. The Duke knew that this gave him some advantages, and everything was going according to his plan. He wanted to play the strongest card. The mercenary looked at the young lady and asked angrily if she had gone deaf. He was furious and said that he asked her if she was a princess. He didn't have time to finish his sentence when suddenly the young lady kicked him. The man fell to the ground with a crash and hit the wall. The young lady looked at him with disdain. His sword flew away, and she grabbed it with lightning speed. The mercenary was in shock, shaking in pain, and wondering who this woman really was. She came closer to him and brought the sword to his throat. Arna looked at him with fury and asked who he was. The mercenary did not answer and looked at her intently. Arna smiled, as she was surprised that she kept her composure, even after having a sword blade pressed to her throat. Arna thought that she seemed to be slowly getting used to the role of an ordinary lady. The man, in turn, was trembling with fear. He did not understand why she was now smiling and looking intently at him. The young lady looked at him with fury and told him not to drag it out. Arna asked who sent him. The man was shaking with fear. He said that he would not tell her anything. Arna understood perfectly well that if she killed him now, she would never know who the customer was. Crave flew into the room with lightning speed and called out to her commander. He looked at her puzzledly and said with a smile that he was a little late. The young lady gave him a fierce look and said that was true. She asked him angrily why it was taking him so long. The boy timidly said that he suddenly wanted to sleep. The man looked at them in bewilderment. Arnie looked at him and asked if he had been shirking his training lately. Crave said that she hadn't been training either. Arnie sighed heavily and said that she was already the best, so she didn't need to train. She decided to drop the subject and told her subordinate to take a closer look at the mercenary. She asked if he was similar to the ones they encountered last time. Crave looked closely at the man and said he was not sure, and also asked who it was. He said the forest bandits looked more like trained knights, and this one looked like a killer. Barn looked at the mercenary in surprise. She, in turn, knew that no one from the Western Empire in their right mind would have done such a stupid thing. She wondered if the mercenary was sent by someone from the Northern Empire. Arna thought that it was most likely the Empress. Arna wondered if this was revenge on Cassian for his recent antics. She was puzzled by this situation and did not know if it was true. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she doubted that he would give them anything. Crave looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she would do. The man stood up and pulled out a dagger. He threw it at the young lady with fury. He shouted that she must die. Arnie continued to talk to Crave. She said she didn't know, but at the same time she easily dodged the knife that was flying at her. The man froze in shock. The young lady caught the knife in anger and threw it back. She said that they could kill him, and that was it. The knife easily pierced the man. The mercenary, in turn, only managed to conclude. Crave looked at his commander and said with a smile that she was the best. The young lady, in turn, felt someone's breath. Crave became alert and drew his sword. A moment later, he was already fighting the man. Crave was surprised and did not know who this man was. He saw that he had no shortage of talent. The man, in turn, came to them because he felt something unusual. The man glanced at the young lady, wondering what was going on here. The knight was a little puzzled because there was a dead man behind the young lady, and she didn't even give a damn. Erica and Eva ran into the mistress's room. They were scared and asked in surprise what had happened. A few minutes later, the butler entered the room and told the knights to lay down their arms immediately. The man looked at the butler with bewilderment, as he was a little puzzled. The butler nodded and smiled as he told Sir Rashalis that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. The butler looked at the lady and said that it would be better for her to spend the night in other rooms. He was glad that the doctor had examined her. The butler said that they had already increased the number of guards so she could rest easy. The young lady thanked the butler for his concern with a smile on her face. The butler smiled and bowed, saying that she could call him if she needed anything, and the young lady agreed. The butler left, and the young lady turned her gaze to the knight who was kneeling before her. He said his name was Rachel, and he was the Archduke's personal knight. He asked for forgiveness for his actions and for not recognizing her. The young lady looked at him intently and said that it was no big deal. She felt very awkward. Rachel said that he was ready to suffer the appropriate punishment. The young lady sighed heavily and said that there was no need for this, as it was simple stupidity. A moment later, the Duke burst into the young lady's room and called his wife. Arna looked at Cassian in bewilderment. She saw that he was very out of breath and shaking. The Duke looked at his wife and said that he had been informed of what had happened and asked if she had been hurt. The young lady smiled and said that she was not hurt at all and was fine. Arnie turned her gaze and looked at the knight. She said with a smile that it was all thanks to Crave, who saved her. The Duke again, in turn, looked closely at the knight. A moment later, the knight smiled and said that he had personally protected Her Highness. The Duke sighed heavily and told his wife that they should spend that night together. Everyone present looked at the Duke in surprise. The young lady in turn asked, shocked, what he was talking about. She was shocked and did not understand what he was talking about. She looked away from him and said that for a minute she thought she had some kind of hearing problem because she heard something crazy. She asked if he really suggested spending the night together. She said that he would never say such a thing. The Duke looked at his wife intently and said that he was not joking. For a moment there was an awkward silence in the room. The Duke said it was natural for a married couple. The young lady shuddered. She said she knew about it. The Duke looked at his wife and asked if she really found him disgusting. She angrily shouted that she did not. The young lady came closer to him and told him not to forget that he had promised her not to touch her without her consent. The Duke looked closely at his wife and said that he remembered it very well, but she looked at him in bewilderment. The Duke looked at her with alarm and said that he could not leave her alone again, knowing that the night was not yet over and that assassins were targeting her. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise and bewilderment. As she now understood what he meant by spending the night together, she sighed heavily, as she thought that he should have said so right away. She looked at him and asked if he thought it was necessary. Arna said that her knight was by her side. The Duke said that he did not want to rely on another man. The Duke looked closely at his wife and with a smile asked her to give him her permission so that he could protect her today. The young lady looked timidly at the Duke and said that she would still do as he wanted, but only this night. She knew that one night would not change anything. An hour and a half later, they were already lying in the same bed. The young lady was in shock as she was uncomfortable. She wondered why she thought everything would be okay. A moment later, Cassian called her. The young lady was puzzled. She wondered why he called her Arna, just wanted to pretend to be asleep, but he approached her. The young lady in turn could not resist and turned to him. He looked at his wife with a smile. Arna looked at him intently and said that she almost killed him. Cassian said that he only thought that her hair was in her way, and he said with a smile that he would gladly accept death at her hands. He said he was sure she was overtired and would hardly fall asleep. The young lady did not answer. He looked at her and asked with a smile if it was because of him. She didn't answer. Cassian smiled and said that she couldn't lie at all. Arnie said that lying was not good. A moment later, he sighed heavily and got out of bed. Arna looked at him in surprise and asked where he was going. He smiled and said that because of him, his dear wife couldn't sleep, so he would go. Cassian looked at the young lady and said that he would work for now so that she could sleep peacefully. The young lady looked at him intently. She felt a bit awkward. For some time the Duke sat silently and worked at his desk while Arna lay silently in bed, unable to sleep. She was puzzled as she could not sleep at all. A moment later she called her husband. Cassian looked at her in surprise. Arnie told him not to tell her mother about what happened. She would inform her later herself. Arna said that her mother was extremely concerned about her health, so she didn't want to worry her. Cassian agreed with her and said that he could well understand her concern because she was very fragile. The young lady in turn only laughed. She looked closely at her husband because she knew that they would get divorced in 3 months, but she still wondered what would happen to him after that. She wondered if he would marry another beautiful woman lady. Arna frowned. She was surprised and did not understand what kind of strange and oppressive feeling she had in her soul. A moment later, the Duke came closer to his wife and called her. He looked at her and asked if everything was okay, since she didn't even notice him approaching. Her Cassian said she looked worried. Arna collected her thoughts and asked her husband why he married her. Cassian came closer to her and touched her tenderly. He timidly said that he would pretend that he had not heard anything. The young lady looked at him intently and did not ask if he would touch her. She said that he was a well-mannered man, and the Duke simply smiled, looking at his wife. Cassian moved closer to her and kissed her tenderly. He quietly said that he was not like that at all now. Cassian kissed his beautiful and charming wife tenderly, but completely absorbed in the kiss. She wondered if kisses were always this sweet. She looked intently at her husband. He smiled and kissed her tenderly on the forehead. Cassian pulled away from his wife and with a smile told her to go to sleep now. The young lady glared at him and wiped her lips. The next day, she and her knight were sitting and enjoying tea. She was in shock as she had not been able to sleep all night. She was sure that she would not give him a break if he dared to touch her. Arna was in shock because she remembered their passionate kiss. She couldn't believe that all this happened to her. She knew that the moment their lips touched, any desire to put him on his shoulder blades completely evaporated. She was banging on the table in rage. Crave was shocked by such behavior of his commander. He looked at her puzzled and asked what was happening to her. Before he could finish speaking, the young lady suddenly grabbed him by the clothes in a fury. He screamed and asked not to kill him. The young man looked at the commander in shock and asked what had come over her. The young lady looked closely at her subordinate, who was looking at her with tears in his eyes. She was a little confused because when he was around, she didn't feel anything. The young lady pushed him away and said he had spots in his eyes and needed to go wash. Crave said with tears in his eyes that he was only washing. Arnie sighed heavily, for she knew that Crave was more of a brother than a man, and she now understood why she felt nothing for him. Cassian came to her. Arnie was surprised, as she did not expect to see him. She looked at her husband with embarrassment and also turned her gaze to his companion. Cassian smiled and said that this was his personal knight, and he had brought him to her now so that he could introduce himself properly. Rashal bowed and greeted the Duchess. He once again asked for forgiveness for what happened. Arnie looked at the knight intently and said that it was an unforeseen circumstance, so they could just forget about it. The Duke looked at his wife and asked if she was okay. After last night, the young lady shuddered. She wondered what he meant. Arna wondered if he meant their kisses. The young lady looked at her husband and said that she was in shock but still holding on. The Duke sighed heavily and looked at her with a smile. The Duke looked at his wife and said that she had said earlier that Sir Crave had protected her. Crave smiled and proudly said that it was so, and he saved her. Highness, the young lady sighed heavily as she realized that he was talking about the killer. The Duke looked closely at his wife and said that the killer's body had literally evaporated, and he did not know why. The Duke said that there was an unknown magical trace left in the room from which the killer disappeared. Cassian said that they had come to the conclusion that for some reason they had managed to get past their guards. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she understood everything. The Duke, in turn, did not think that the Emperor had decided to attempt on the life of the Archduchess. He looked at his wife and said that therefore, so that nothing like this would happen again in the future, Rashal would accompany her. He said that he thought it would be best if she was protected not only by Sir Crave, but also by another knight. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment. She was in shock as she did not expect to hear such a thing. Arn was taken aback and looking at her husband, told him to wait a little, since she knew that of course she was important, but his safety was no small matter either. Crave looked at the Duke with a smile and said that his wife was under his personal protection and everything would be fine. The Duke frowned as he looked at the young man, wondering if he was acting so confident because he was a swordmaster. Cassian looked at the knight and said that he trusted him. The young lady in turn was very glad, since otherwise everything would have been completely bad. The Duke smiled and said that he had a little more work to do and would now be leaving the estate. More often he looked at his wife and said that he would like to introduce her to a man who would help her while he was not at home. A moment later, Count Alan Ermano greeted the Archduchess, telling her that she could simply call him Alan. The young lady smiled and also introduced herself. She said that she was very glad to meet him. He smiled and said that it was a great honor for him. Alan, in turn, was puzzled and did not understand why the Duke asked him to look after the Duchess, since he knew that things were not going well for him. Alan looked at the Duke and saw his terrible look. He was shocked and felt uneasy. A moment later he changed, and with their lightning speed, told the young lady that he would serve her for the rest of his days. Cassian glanced sideways at his wife and said that it was time for him to go and that she could enjoy her tea. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and thanked him. The Duke looked at his subordinates and said that they should now go about their business. Rachel said firmly and decisively that he would do everything. At the same time, the imperial palace was in complete chaos. The emperor furiously asked his subordinates if it was really so difficult to kill the Archduchess. The emperor did not understand how they could fail the task, having managed to get through her guards and get out into the chamber. He looked at them and told them to try again. The emperor furiously told them to try their best, but kill her. The assistant approached the emperor and said that the number of guards at the Duke's estate had been tripled. The emperor was furious and wondered if there was no hope. The man looked at the emperor and said that this was not entirely true. The emperor looked angrily at his assistant and asked what he meant. He asked if he really had an idea. A moment later, the assistant came closer to the emperor and asked what was going on, and he quietly whispered the entire plan of action into his ear. The emperor said with a smile that this was a very interesting idea and also praised his assistant. The emperor said with a smile that he always knew that it was not in vain that he kept him near him. The Duke looked at his knight and told him to protect his wife from afar so that no one would notice him. The rider bowed and said that he would certainly do everything. The young lady sat quietly, with her knight engaging in casual conversation, while Rachel watched quietly from afar. He watched the lady intently, without looking away. Crave looked into the distance in surprise. Evermore looked at the knight angrily and told him to clean it properly. The young man was a little puzzled, as it seemed to him that someone was hiding behind the building. Rachel was very angry, as he was almost noticed. He realized that the knight had a very good sense. A moment later, he heard some footsteps. He watched everyone present closely and wondered what happened there. The assistant looked at his master and said that they had received an invitation from the palace. The Duke sighed heavily. He was surprised to receive an invitation from the palace. He said that he thought they were up to something. The Count said that of course they were up to something, and it was a trap. The Duke just looked at the invitation with a grin. The Count looked at his master and asked what he would do. Cassian looked at the invitation with a grin. He didn't even know what to do. The Count asked the Duke if he could ignore it and take another opportunity. He said that it was also literally the same as entering a dragon's lair and trying to catch it. A moment later they heard some noise. Rachalus knocked on the door and said it was him. The Duke looked at the knight in surprise and asked what he wanted to report. The knight said that at noon, the murderer entered the estate, disguised as a servant, and Sir Crave dealt with him with ease. The Count said with delight that it seemed the knight was no slouch. He said that last time the knight also saved the Duchess from an attack. Rachel frowned and said that he was of course talented, but his sword was also unusual. The Duke looked at the knight in surprise and asked what sword he was talking about. Rashal said that sometimes it would seem as if Sir Crave was having a conversation with him, and based on the fact that the sword had a mind, he believed that it was the dragon sword Levitani, the dragon sword of Levitan, the wreath that pierced the dragon's heart. And having received his powers and incredible abilities meant that he was a master of the sword. The Duke in turn understood that everything pointed to this, that it was Sir Crave who was the master of the sword, but for some reason something did not add up. The knight looked at his master and called him. He was puzzled. Cassian looked at the knight in bewilderment and asked if there was anything else. Rashal said it was just his guess, but he felt like the Archduchess was no ordinary princess. Cassian looked at his knight in confusion and asked what exactly he meant. Rashal said she didn't even flinch when Sir Crave dealt with the assassin. He said she sat quietly sipping tea next to them. He said that just like the night before, when she was assassinated, Her Highness did not lose her composure, despite the fact that a dead man lay before her. Rashal asked in confusion how one could remain sane when life was in danger. He said that moreover, unlike other ladies, she was not afraid of corpses at all, and for him, this was something unimaginable. The Duke thought for a moment, but did not answer. The lady spent the whole time teaching Madame Etiquette lessons for ladies. A moment later, she felt that someone was watching her, and looking out the window, she saw her husband. The young lady greeted him with a smile and waved her hand. The madam looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she felt very happy and warm in her heart. As soon as she saw them interacting with each other, the young lady thanked the madam. The Marquise looked at the young lady and said that her heart bled after hearing the news of how she had been treated at the palace, and said that it was very pleasant to see that this was a stage that had been passed for her. The young lady looked away and said in a puzzled tone that it was very terrible. The Marquise told the young lady that she heard that she was weak in body but still strong in spirit, so she should not worry too much about it. The young lady laughed and said that it could be said that way. The Marchioness said with a smile that she was very happy that Cassian had grown up quickly and married such a wonderful lady. Madame smiled and said that the status of Archduchess of Terneuzen was special, and not everyone was worthy of becoming one. The young lady looked at Madame in bewilderment. Cassian was orphaned at a very young age, so no one knew what family love was. The Marchioness, in turn, looked after him for a very short time. He grew up alone, practically locked up in the Terneuzen estate, and only upon reaching the age of consciousness did he invite people to come to him. But none of them even tried to recognize the real Cassian. All the people who approached him only wanted to get what he had. The Marchioness said that they all had either political motives or wanted riches, hiding behind the name of Archduke. None of them waved their hand to him as joyfully as the young lady was doing now. The Marquise bowed to the young lady and said that this is why the status of Archduchess is very special. Arna was surprised by such a statement. The Marquise asked the Archdukes with a smile to take care of him, as she was doing. Now she asked with all her heart. The young lady was shocked and didn't know how to answer. The Duchess looked at her daughter and asked if something had died in the forest. The Duchess said that she had called her first, and it was simply a divine miracle. The young lady was in deep thought, as she wanted to divorce her husband in 2 months, and today she was asked to look after him. The Duchess looked at her daughter and asked why she was so serious. The Duchess looked at her daughter puzzled and asked if something had happened. The young lady looked at her mother and called her. Arna was very excited. A moment later, the young lady asked her mother if it was true that she could get a divorce. The Duchess looked at her daughter in surprise and asked why she was asking about this. So suddenly, Arnie looked away from her mother and said that she was worried that she would scold her again and marry her off to someone else again. The Duchess smiled and said that she had insisted on the marriage because she had never held hands with anyone, not even hand, and she was always worried that she might feel lonely. The young lady looked at her mother in surprise and said that she had never suffered from loneliness. The Duchess said that now it may be so, but people have the ability to leave lives The Duchess smiled and said that as she herself knew swordmasters live longer than ordinary people, so she was especially excited. The Duchess looked at her daughter and asked if she understood what she meant. The young lady smiled and told her mother that she was worrying too much. "We have a request. Who else would protect her blood if not her?" The young lady looked away in embarrassment and told her mother that she was much weaker than her. The Duchess smiled and said that one cannot survive in this world by strength. The Duchess looked at her daughter with a fixed gaze and said with a smile that she was free to do whatever she wanted in her life. The young lady thought for a moment, but did not answer. A moment later, she asked if she could get a divorce and leave right now. The Duchess was shocked. She told her daughter that she had to keep her promise. The Duchess, yawning, said that her eyes were already closing, so she asked her daughter to call tomorrow and wished her good night. A moment later, the Duchess cut off the connection. The young lady was surprised as she did not expect such a thing. Arnie was very strong, worried. She knew that if she stayed here longer, he could make her change her mind. Now she clearly understood what her mother was telling her. And a moment later she saw her husband. The Duke looked at her and said with a smile that he had come to tell her that there would be a banquet at the palace tomorrow. The young lady looked intently at her husband. She knew that his approach was as silent as moonlight. The Duke looked at his wife in bewilderment and called her as he saw her slowly approaching him. Arnie came closer to her husband and hugged him tenderly. She smiled tenderly as she could hear his heart beating. The Duke, in turn, was a little surprised by his wife's behavior, but was also embarrassed. She remembered the words of the Marquise, who said that all the people who approached the Duke only wanted to get what he had. They all had either political motives or wanted wealth. The young lady looked closely at her husband. She understood that since he grew up in such an environment, it was understandable why he was used to hiding his presence. She genuinely wanted to know more about him. Cassian looked at her and asked with a smile if she was really so enchanted by his face that she kept staring at it. The young lady smiled and said softly that it was so. She looked at him intently and said that he was very handsome. "You in turn." The young man froze and looked at her embarrassedly. A moment later he laughed. He said with a smile that in that case he should take better care of himself since she liked his appearance. The young lady laughed and said that it was a great idea. The next day, the young couple went to the palace of the Emperor of the Northern Empire. He told his wife that they had already arrived and asked her to go down carefully. The young lady thanked him for his help. The Duke smiled and said that today's banquet would be very noisy. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise and asked why this was so. He smiled but did not answer. The man looked at the Count and asked if he also didn't know why they had been gathered. The Count smiled and said that he too was very surprised by the unexpected invitation. Everyone was surprised, as the situation was unusual, as it was rare to be invited to a banquet. The day before the start, they said that since they had gathered here, they could still enjoy today's reception. Tessalaka looked at the Duke in surprise and called him. He, in turn, was very nervous. The Duke said that they could discuss his case at the estate, but Tessalak could not allow this to happen, as he knew that the Duke needed to know about everything immediately. Crave looked at the Archduke and said with a smile that he would guard the Archduchess so that he could go about his business in peace. The Archduke looked at the knight intently and said that it was very wonderful, and he appreciated his concern. Crave smiled and told the Archduke that he, in turn, need not worry about anything. A moment later, the Crown Prince saw the young lady. He looked at her with an embarrassed smile. He was very happy because he finally saw his little bird. The young lady turned around as she had the feeling that someone was drilling into her. The young lady raised her gaze higher and saw the Crown Prince, who continued to greet her with a smile on his face. She was a little puzzled as she saw that he was back to his old ways. Crave looked at the prince in surprise and wondered what he was staring at. Crave looked at the prince and asked his commander if this was the gifted intelligent crown prince she had spoken of. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was him. The young man looked at him in surprise and said that he looked normal. Crave's son looked at his commander in bewilderment as the young lady turned and walked in the other direction. The young lady looked closely at the guests, as she thought that she would at least see the emperor today, but she saw that even the empress was not at the reception. She wondered if the empress had been locked in the palace because of yesterday. Walking through the hall, she noticed her husband, who was talking to a man. Crave looked at the commander and asked what was the matter, as he saw that she did not look like herself. The young lady did not answer. A moment later, she said that something was bothering her. The young man on the highway looked at her in surprise and asked what exactly was bothering her. She said she wanted to know something about someone. Crave looked at her with bewilderment and asked if she could just go and ask. She sighed heavily and said she didn't want to be responsible for the consequences, since her knowledge could confuse the person. She said that another fact worried her most. She looked closely at her husband. Crave, in turn, saw that his commander was not taking his gaze off his husband. The lady, in turn, wondered whether she could even wish to know him better. She said that she was tormented by doubts. She still thought that it was better for her not to cross this line. She knew that even if one day their paths diverged, she had to respect him and mind her own business. She looked at her friend and told him to forget. She said she didn't know why she was even thinking about it. The young lady looked at the knight in bewilderment and asked why he was suddenly so hungry. Crave looked at her with confusion and asked if she was really his commander. He asked if someone had entered her body and was now pretending to be her. Arnie looked at him and asked what he was even saying. She said that she was absolutely serious about talking to him. Now Crave looked at her puzzled and said that their commander would never say such a thing. Crave looked at the young lady in shock and asked if she had fallen in love with him. Aarna asked furiously what he was even talking about. The knight said that there was simply no other explanation. The young lady looked at him and asked if she was just curious. Crave shouted that his commander was not like that. The young lady looked at him in surprise. Express force, what it is in his opinion. Crave said that she was a person who was not interested in anything. A reckless person who thought about death. But she knocked at the door. The young lady looked at him puzzled and asked what he was talking about. Crave looked at her in surprise and said that if it wasn't so, then it was very strange. She looked at him with fury and asked if she should hit him once. The young man frowned and said that she was a member of the Order of the Golden Dragon. Ever since the captain saved his life on the battlefield 10 years ago, as a respected warrior, as an excellent knight, he devoted himself to her. Arnie looked closely at the young man and asked if he was okay. The young man was surprised, but quickly coming to his senses, he said that he was okay. She looked at him closely and said that since he was unharmed, he needed to get up quickly, as it was dangerous here. Crave looked at his commander and said that now he understood why she was frowning so. The crown prince was furious. He did not understand why some second-rate knight was pestering his little bird. The prince knew that he had to get rid of him immediately. He rushed towards the young lady with lightning speed, and as he walked through the hall, he saw people standing and whispering. The prince quietly came closer and noticed that it was the Empress's chamberlain. And the emperor's secretary looked at his opponent and said that they needed to first make sure that the plan had succeeded. He said that they needed to separate the red-haired knight and the archduchess. The crown prince quietly listened to what they were talking about. He realized that they were talking about the man who was next to his young lady. The men were a little puzzled, as they did not know who would be suitable for this task. A moment later, the crown prince smiled and said that he would help them. The men were taken aback and flinched. The crown prince said he didn't know why they were planning this, but he would be happy to get rid of the red-haired man and let the archduchess breathe a sigh of relief. He came closer to them and asked with a smile what they were whispering about. The men looked at the prince in confusion, but did not answer. The young lady looked at her friend and asked if he was really so upset over such a small thing. The young lady sighed heavily and, asking for forgiveness, told him to forget about what she had told him. The prince approached the young lady and said with a smile that his bird was simply charming. Today he asked what they had been discussing here. Crave looked at the crown prince and greeted him with honor. The prince smiled and said that there was no need for a greeting. He said that he did not think that they had any urgent business. The knight looked at the prince in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. The prince said with a grin that something must have happened since the overseer was looking for him. Crave, you are very surprised, and asked the prince what he was talking about. Arna looked at our knight and said that he could go. Prince, you, in turn, were very pleased. Crave looked at the prince, for it was clear as daylight that he was trying to send him away to pester the commander, but he had no intention of simply up and leaving. Crave looked at the crown prince and, asking for forgiveness, said that unfortunately he did not know where the overseer was. He asked the prince if he could show him and escort him. The prize was shocked and wondered why he should do this. The knight smiled, looking at the prince, and asked if he had not come to tell him this news. The prince was furious because he was about to have sex with the young lady. Crave smiled and said that they needed to go. Already, the prince was in shock as he did not want to go anywhere. The young lady, in turn, looked at her husband. She saw that he was very busy. Arna was a little puzzled, as she had not felt this way the last time she had been at the banquet. The young lady sighed heavily, wondering why she had been feeling so sad these last few days. The young lady approached the archduchess and asked with a smile if it was really she. Arna looked at the young lady with bewilderment and asked who she was. The young lady smiled and said that she was the daughter of Count Frisia. She said that she hoped she had not offended her in any way. Arna looked at the young lady in surprise and said that everything was fine. The young lady smiled and said that she had always wanted to meet her. The young lady smiled and said that their meeting could only be called fate. She said that they could celebrate it with something delicious. A moment later, she called the waiter to them. The young lady asked the archduchess if she had come to them from the Western Empire. The young lady gave the archduchess a glass of wine and asked her to take it. Arna looked at the lady and said that it was, so the lady looked at her and asked if it was true that they eat apples covered in gold there. Arna smiled and said that they were called golden, not because they were covered with gold, but because of their bright yellow color. The young lady smiled and said that she understood everything, and she was very interested. Arna frowned and stared into her wine glass. The young lady smiled, looking at the archduchess, and said that the wine was incredibly delicious. The lady asked her if she would like to try it. Arna looked at the young lady and said that she would try it now. Arnie took one sip and, staggering, said she felt like she was already drunk. A moment later she recoiled, and the waiter caught her deftly. The waiter looked at the young lady with a grin, since the kidnapping of the archduchess had been successful. The young lady, in turn, looked at the man with a grin. She was glad that they managed to get through everything so quickly. As Crave and the crown prince walked down the corridor, he wondered if everything would be okay with the commander. He was very upset because they were interrupted right in the middle of an important conversation. The prince looked at the knight and said that he should go into the room, and he in turn returned back. The young man looked at the prince and thanked him for showing him the way. Crave bowed politely to the crown prince, but the crown prince took his turn and was very angry because he had lost time. A moment later, the young man entered and saw the manager. He said he was told that the managers had called him, but a moment later someone attacked him from behind the door. The young man was surprised, as he did not expect such a sudden attack, and he dodged the blow with lightning speed. But the counterattack was not long in coming. He furiously dealt a crushing blow to the man. Crave looked at the manager and said angrily that he had a rat in here. Crave, in turn, was very angry. He came closer to the manager and asked if it was possible that he knew this man. The manager was trembling with fear. He did not know what to do, but a moment later he shouted that he knew nothing and rushed away with lightning speed. Crave. He looked at the man with puzzlement and surprise. He didn't understand what was going on. Crave decided to examine the man, but he realized that there were no identifying marks. The young man was confused. He wondered why he had attacked him. He knew there was no apparent reason, and he had not even insulted anyone. For a moment he was taken aback, as he thought that it was all connected with his commander, and with the speed of lightning, he got up and decided to go and look for her. Entering the hall, he looked in every corner, but she was nowhere to be found. The emperor looked at his secretary and told him to detain the empress, as she could not appear at the banquet. The secretary said that he would do everything. The emperor looked at the secretary and asked if there was any news about the archduchess. The secretary said that we had to wait a little longer. The emperor heard a knock on the door, but a moment later a man burst into their room. He approached the emperor and said that they had successfully poisoned the archduchess, and he was very happy with this news. The emperor smiled and said that he had complicated things before, but there was still a simple and effective way. The man told the emperor that as he had ordered, they had captured and transported her to another place. He asked what they should do next. The man asked if they should kill her. The emperor's son grinned contentedly and told him to leave her alive, as she would still be useful. The emperor said that instead they would now go to the ballroom and admire the expression on the noble Cassian's face. The young man was talking to his opponent, but his thoughts were far away. He was interested in what that look from his wife meant. The young man saw that the crown prince had not taken his eyes off her from the moment they entered the hall, and he approached her as soon as his attention was distracted. The young man looked at his wife with confusion, wondering why she looked worried. Even next to the swordmaster, he saw that it was the opposite, and his presence worried her even more. He noticed that when their eyes met, she quickly looked away, as if trying to avoid his gaze. He was worried and wondered what was bothering her. Cassian wondered if he'd been a little slow that night. He was in shock and did not understand why his heart was so restless. He did not understand why he could not calm down. The man ran up to the Archduke and shouted that they were in trouble. The man shouted that Her Highness the Archduke was nowhere to be found. Cassian froze in shock, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The Archduke looked at the Count and asked where the sir who had accompanied her was now. The Count hesitated and wanted to report everything but did not have time. A moment later, it was announced that the son of the Empire, the great emperor, had arrived. The emperor smiled and, looking at everyone present, thanked those who brightened the evening with their presence. He looked at everyone with a smile and asked if he was to their liking or not. A moment later, the emperor looked at the young man with a grin. He came closer to him and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. Cassian smiled and said that he was also glad to see him. He said that, however, they had not seen each other for a long time. The emperor smiled and said that he had a lot to do, that there was no time left for anything. The emperor looked at the young duke with a grin and asked where his wife was. The emperor said that he had gone through a lot to approve his marriage. Cassian hesitated, not knowing what to answer, but looked at the emperor with a smile on his face. A moment later, the young lady entered the hall and with a smile apologized to the emperor for being late. The emperor looked at the young lady in shock, but her husband was no less surprised.